In the grey hour before full light, when the Norman countryside emerges from darkness like a photograph developing in water, the fields around Falaise exist in a state of profound stillness. The grass, long since trampled and scarred by the passage of armies, holds the dew of an August morning that has come too many times in the summer of 1944, each dawn much like the last, each one bringing new exhaust and ash to meadows that had known only the gentle work of farmers for centuries before. There is the smell of earth, that deep, almost mineral scent that rises when soil has been turned too roughly, when tank tracks have cut through it and left it exposed to the cooling air. In the distance, perhaps a mile away across the undulating terrain, a crow calls out, not the cheerful sound of a bird without knowledge, but something sharper, almost insistent, as if the crow itself understands that this landscape has become a place of loss. The mist clings to the low ground, filling the Norman bocage, that dense network of hedgerows and sunken lanes that divides the countryside into a labyrinth, making of it something dreamlike, impenetrable at first glance. Here, in this moment before the sun truly breaks the horizon, it is hard to imagine that within hours or days, this field will be filled with the roar of engines, the crack of small arms fire, the terrible silence that follows when metal tears through flesh. But that moment is coming, and to understand it properly, to inhabit the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope of the men caught in what historians would come to call the Falaise pocket, we must first know the quietness that precedes it. If you find yourself drawn to these untold stories of the Normandy campaign, the intimate, overlooked moments within one of the war's most decisive battles, you might consider subscribing to this channel for more deeply researched World War II documentaries that linger on the Waffen-SS at Falaise and the escape from the pocket, stories told with the same unhurried attention to texture and human detail that we bring here. The fields that surround you in this moment of imagined dawn were, just weeks before, part of the Norman landscape that Allied forces had been fighting through since June 6th. The breakout from the beachheads, the long, grinding push from Normandy into the interior, had been harder than some planners had hoped, slower than the maps had suggested it might be. The bocage itself had become a weapon, its dense hedgerows and hidden lanes perfect for defense, perfect for slowing an advancing army. But by the beginning of August, something had shifted. The Allies had broken through in Normandy proper. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, had ordered an offensive to the south and then east, an ambitious maneuver designed to circle around the German forces that were still fighting in the Norman countryside. And the Germans, for their part, had ordered a counterattack. They would strike westward, toward Mortagne, hoping to cut the American supply lines and restore what they could of their deteriorating position in northern France. It was a miscalculation, though in the grey hours before dawn on August 6th, nobody quite yet understood the enormity of that error. The German High Command believed, or at least hoped, that such a blow might turn the tide. Instead, what it would do was leave German forces, including several divisions of the Waffen-SS, exposed to encirclement. The Americans would hold their ground. The British and Canadians, pushing east and south from the Normandy coast, would advance toward Falaise itself, and soon the trap would begin to close. The Waffen-SS divisions caught in this gathering catastrophe were among the most formidable fighting forces Germany could field. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Oberfuhrer Paul Hauser, consisted of hardened men who had seen combat in Russia, men who had been indoctrinated into the ideology of the Nazi regime from their youth. There was the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, which had acquired a terrible reputation for violence and ruthlessness, the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, the 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg, and various other units of the Waffen-SS, including regular infantry divisions and smaller combat formations. These men were not conscripts, at least not entirely. Many had volunteered or had been trained from boyhood in the Hitler Youth and pressed into service. Their morale, even in the face of obvious German strategic decline, remained formidable. They believed in their training, in their officers, in a kind of fighting spirit that had been cultivated through years of propaganda and military conditioning. And yet, by the summer of 1944, this morale was fraying. The war in France was not the war in Russia, but it was no less attritional. The Allies had air superiority, nearly complete air superiority. They outnumbered German forces in tanks, in artillery, in the sheer weight of materiel that could be brought to bear. The men of the Waffen-SS, despite their training and their will to fight, had begun to understand, in a way they could not quite admit, that the outcome was no longer in doubt. What they faced now was not victory, but survival. The geography of the Falaise pocket would shape everything that followed. Imagine the landscape as a kind of bowl, with the town of Falaise itself sitting at the northern rim. To the west and south, the American armies were advancing. To the north and east, the British and Canadians, along with Polish forces, were pushing from the coast. The pocket was not entirely closed even in its most desperate days. There was always a narrow corridor, a gap through which German forces might attempt to escape. The key villages in this drama were Chambois, which would come to be fiercely contested, Trun, which sat at a crucial junction, and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, a small hamlet that would, in the final days of the pocket, become a bottleneck through which thousands of German soldiers and vehicles attempted to pass. The road network was limited, the terrain broken by hedgerows and small forests. The Norman landscape, so beautiful in peacetime, so deadly in war, would dictate much of what could happen. A panzer column could not move freely as it might across open ground in Russia. Vehicles had to use the roads, had to funnel through the narrow lanes between the hedgerows. And those roads, as the pocket tightened, would become shooting galleries. There is something about a dawn in August, particularly in the Norman countryside, that carries within it a certain poignancy. The light, when it comes, is neither harsh nor forgiving. It illuminates the landscape with a kind of neutrality, indifferent to what has occurred upon it. In this light, the grass is green, the hedgerows are dense and full, the fields stretch away toward the horizon, much as they have for centuries, and yet everything is changed. The earth itself has been altered by the passage of war. How many men would see this dawn and not see another? How many would pass through this landscape and leave something of themselves behind, permanently, in the soil? There is something profoundly human in the impulse to bear witness to history, to sit quietly with the weight of events that shaped our world and the lives of people we will never know. And if you find yourself drawn to these slow, patient explorations of World War II, the kind where we linger not on the triumphant moments alone, but on the grinding exhaustion, the impossible choices, and the small luminous details that make history feel like something alive and breathing, then perhaps you might consider following along with us. We create these deeply researched documentaries with the intention of honoring both accuracy and the contemplative space you deserve when you come to learn. Each one is built with the care of someone who understands that sleep and serious history need not be strangers, that you can drift toward rest while engaging with the profound complexities of the past. The Falaise pocket, which we are about to enter together, is a case in point, a narrative so layered, so thick with human experience and strategic consequence, that it rewards the kind of unhurried attention that a journey like this one allows. And there are many others waiting: the quiet tragedy of the Warsaw Uprising, the moral ambiguities of the Desert War, the snow-covered retreats on the Eastern Front, stories that deserve to be told not in haste or with sensationalism, but with the kind of reflective pacing that lets you absorb them not just with your mind, but with something deeper. If this is the kind of historical storytelling that speaks to you, research-grounded, visually detailed in the mind's eye, and designed to meet you in that tender space between wakefulness and sleep, then subscribing would mean you never miss one of these explorations. It is, quite simply, an invitation to continue walking through history together, to build a archive of understanding that unfolds one quiet night at a time. And now, as we prepare to descend into the specific moment of August 1944, as the armies close in and the German forces find themselves pressed into an ever-tightening grip, Let us gather the threads of what led to this crisis. The breakthrough from Normandy had been costly and grinding, but by early August, the Allies sensed something shifting, a momentum that, if seized correctly, might accelerate the entire liberation of France. It is in this atmosphere of strategic possibility, thick with opportunity and peril alike, that our story truly begins to take its shape. By the first week of August 1944, something fundamental had shifted in the rhythm of the Normandy campaign. The beaches where the Allies had landed 2 months before, those deadly strips of sand and stone that had seemed, in early June, to be the entire world, had become merely the beginning of a much larger and more consequential story. The breakout from the narrow, bocage-choked regions around the beachhead had finally gathered momentum. American forces under General Omar Bradley had pushed south and west with increasing speed, their columns grinding through villages with names that would fade from memory for most who heard them, yet which represented, for each soldier, the measure of survival and advance. To the east and north, British and Canadian forces under Montgomery had been grinding away at the German defenders with methodical, costly pressure. And now, across the Norman landscape in that humid August dawn, the shape of something else entirely was beginning to crystallize. The German High Command, in their various headquarters and command posts, scattered across northern France, had become acutely aware of a terrible danger. What had been, for weeks, a desperate defensive battle was about to transform into something far worse, a race against encirclement. The Allies were no longer content to push forward in grinding, linear fashion. They had begun to execute a strategy of maneuver, a sweeping movement that was meant to cut off not just the immediate defenders, but entire armies. Can you imagine, in those early August days, the awareness gradually dawning on German commanders as they received reports of American columns racing northward toward Falaise and beyond? It was not the sudden shock of catastrophe that sometimes arrives without warning, but rather the slow, sickening recognition that the net was beginning to close. The American 12th Army Group, driving east and north from the breakout zone, was pivoting toward the town of Falaise itself. Concurrently, Canadian and Polish forces were beginning to press southward from their positions near Caen. The intention, never fully articulated in a single unified command, for the Allies, even in victory, remained a coalition of separate national armies with separate concerns, was nonetheless the same: to trap the German forces still holding positions in Normandy by closing a gap that seemed, day by day, to be shrinking. Where the armies met, there would be a pocket. Within that pocket would be trapped not merely a division or two, but multiple German corps. Among them would be some of the most elite and dangerous units in the Wehrmacht, the Waffen-SS divisions, those armored formations that had been shuffled into Normandy over recent weeks to shore up the crumbling German defensive line. The logic of this encirclement, when you consider it in the silence of these August hours, is almost mathematical in its cold elegance. The Germans were heavily committed to holding certain positions, defensive lines, key towns, terrain that the High Command believed essential to preventing an American breakthrough. But in committing their forces to these positions, they had created exactly the conditions for their own envelopment. Their armies were strung out, their reserves had been committed piecemeal to stem successive crises, and their command structure was increasingly paralyzed by the simultaneous demands of fighting forward and preparing to withdraw. Most critically, they lacked the mobility and the air cover that might have allowed them to execute a coordinated fighting withdrawal. Every movement by day brought risk from Allied aircraft. Every day that passed saw the gap between the northern and southern jaws of the Allied vice grow smaller. In the small hours of August 8th, as these shifting movements continued across the Norman landscape, the German 7th Army under General Paul Hauser was still receiving orders to counterattack, to push back the American spearhead and recover lost ground. This would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions of the entire campaign. The attempt to drive north toward Mortain would, in the end, only drive German forces deeper into the forming pocket and commit their most mobile reserves to a desperate attack that would be stopped and reversed within days. Yet the decision was made from a certain logic. From the German perspective, the situation was already becoming dire. The only hope seemed to lie in a sudden, violent blow that might disrupt the Allied advance and buy time for a more orderly withdrawal. Instead, it would hasten the catastrophe that was already taking shape. And so the armies continued their movements. The landscape between Falaise and Argentan, between Chambois and Alençon, between Saint-Lambert and Trun, became the stage upon which one of the largest encirclements in European military history would unfold. The roads that crossed this ground, secondary roads, farm tracks, narrow lanes bordered by high hedges and Norman stone walls, would soon become crowded with desperate men and machines. The fields themselves, which in early August still held the green of summer and the quiet of the agricultural year, would be transformed into something altogether different. Smoke and ash would darken the sky, the earth would be scarred by tank tracks and artillery impacts. The narrow villages that marked the geography of this region would become flashpoints of violence and desperation. But in these hours before that violence reached its peak intensity, there was still a kind of terrible motion, a sense of gears turning inexorably. And within that motion were thousands of men, German soldiers, many of them exhausted after weeks of nearly continuous combat, many of them aware, at some level, that the situation had become dire, yet still bound by discipline and duty and the simple momentum of military organization. They could not see, as the historians and commanders reviewing maps could see, the shape of the pocket that was forming. They could not know that within days they would be fighting not to advance or to hold fixed positions, but simply to survive, and to find some narrow corridor through which to escape the closing trap. The geometry of their doom was being drawn, even as they moved, even as they fought, even as they rested briefly in Norman farmyards and beside roads where the summer dust hung in the still air. By August, the formations caught within the tightening ring were far from the confident, ideologically steeled divisions that had rolled across Europe in earlier years. The Waffen-SS units trapped near Falaise represented something more complicated. Younger soldiers mixed with scarred veterans, some still burning with fervent belief, others simply exhausted and trying to survive the next dawn. The composition of these divisions tells us something important about how any army changes under the weight of prolonged, grinding warfare. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Oberfuhrer Paul Hauser, had come together from multiple units over the summer of 1944. There was the Das Reich Division, still formidable despite its losses, with its mechanized infantry and tank companies spread thin across the collapsing front. There was the Hohenstaufen Division, younger and less experienced than Das Reich, but still equipped with Panther tanks and capable soldiers. Beyond these, fragments of the Hitler Youth Division, the youngest of all, raw recruits in their teens and early 20s, had been fed into the grinding machinery of the Normandy campaign. The Götz von Berlichingen Division, named after a medieval robber knight, was also present, a curious echo of Nazi romanticism amidst the concrete reality of modern warfare. What had these men experienced in the weeks before the pocket began to close? Relentless combat, day after day of defensive battles against numerically superior Allied forces, air attacks that came without warning, artillery barrages that shook the earth and left men's ears ringing for hours afterward. The attrition had been severe. A battalion that might have entered Normandy with 600 men could be down to 200 by late July. Tank crews lost their vehicles one after another, sometimes to enemy fire, sometimes to mechanical breakdown, with no replacement parts available. Infantry squads were consolidated, merged, reorganized, with men who had never trained together, creating a kind of tactical fluidity born entirely from necessity rather than planning. The morale of these soldiers existed in a strange, almost paradoxical state. Some accounts suggest that the younger men, particularly those in the Hitler Youth Division, still harbored a kind of desperate idealism. They had been told they were defending the homeland, that the Eastern Front had already turned desperate, that every kilometre they held in Normandy bought time for some miraculous German recovery. Others, and perhaps these were the majority of the veterans, had moved beyond idealism into something more primal. They fought because they were soldiers, because their officers ordered them to hold positions, because surrender itself seemed uncertain and frightening. A captured Waffen-SS private later wrote in his diary that he no longer thought about victory, he thought about food, about ammunition, about the possibility of seeing his mother again. Such testimony is sparse but revealing. The physical exhaustion was unrelenting. Soldiers were sleeping in shifts measured in minutes, often in open fields or hastily dug foxholes. The summer of 1944 had been warm, almost impossibly so, and water was scarce. Dysentery was common. Wounds that might have been treatable in a stable rear area had to be managed in the field with limited medical supplies. The men's uniforms were filthy, their faces gaunt and aged beyond their years. Photographs taken of captured Waffen-SS soldiers during this period often show something almost haunting. Not the fierce warriors of Nazi mythology, but hollow-eyed young men who had been pressed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, these divisions still retained combat capability. The Waffen-SS had always prided itself on training and cohesion. Even depleted, even exhausted, these formations could still mount counterattacks, could still hold a defensive line with discipline. The officers, the Obersturmführers and Sturmbannführers, many of them career soldiers, maintained a kind of iron routine even as the strategic situation deteriorated. Orders were orders. The front was held. Or it wasn't. And if it wasn't, you fell back and held the next line. This was the rhythm of August 1944. Some historians have suggested that the psychological state of these trapped soldiers existed in a peculiar liminal space. They were not yet truly convinced that defeat was inevitable. The German command structure still spoke, or appeared to speak, of breakout operations, of relief attacks from outside the pocket, of tactical withdrawals that might somehow transform into counter-offensives. Radio communications from higher command alternated between optimism and desperate urgency. Hold this position. Fall back to the next line. Concentrate strength for a breakthrough. The conflicting orders themselves created a kind of fog, not just of war, but of understanding. What was actually happening? Were they winning or losing? The truth, visible from above to Allied planners, remained opaque to the men dug into the Norman soil. Consider what it might have felt like to be a young soldier in one of these divisions as August wore on. You had come to Normandy believing, perhaps, that the invasion would be quickly repelled. That had not happened. Instead, months of fighting had followed. Your friends had been killed or wounded. You had fired your rifle or machine gun more times than you could count. You had seen things that would shape your dreams for decades, if you survived to dream. And now, in these final days of summer, word had begun to circulate, quietly, man to man, in the way soldiers communicate truth, that officers have not yet officially acknowledged, that you were surrounded, that the perimeter was closing, that escape might depend on speed, luck, and darkness. The spiritual state of belief, that intangible thing that might sustain soldiers through hardship, was fragmenting. Some of the younger men, particularly those from the Hitler Youth Division, still clung to Nazi ideology with a kind of desperation that might almost be called tragic. They had been shaped by the regime since childhood. The Nazi worldview was all they had ever known. How could one simply abandon it in the face of military collapse? Others, particularly the older veterans who had seen the Eastern Front, or who had families somewhere in the rapidly shrinking Reich, felt only a kind of numb resignation. This was war. This was what happened when you lost. The physical composition of these divisions had also been affected by the pattern of fighting. Tank units had been depleted, not just in vehicles, but in trained crews. A new Panther tank might arrive from a repair depot, but the men needed to operate it. The commander, the gunner, the loader, the driver, were drawn from diminished pools of experienced personnel. Infantry platoons lacked their full complement of men. Logistical units were overwhelmed. The divisions functioned, still, as military organizations, but they were like organisms that had been subjected to repeated trauma and were still trying to maintain their shape through sheer will. And so, as the pocket began to form, as the first reports of Polish and Canadian forces advancing from the north reached divisional headquarters, these exhausted, depleted, morally fractured but still dangerous formations faced a choice that was not truly a choice at all. They had to hold their positions or retreat. They had to obey orders or attempt to escape. They had to survive the next hour, the next day, the next week. The larger questions of whether this made any ultimate difference, whether their continued fighting changed the course of history, remained abstract. The immediate question was always the same: would you see the morning? The closing ring of Allied armies was not a perfect circle, and geography, in those final days of August, became the invisible architect of what would unfold. To understand the Falaise pocket is to understand the land itself, the Norman countryside, with its particular geometry of escape routes and fatal narrowing passages, the villages that would become synonymous with encirclement and desperation, the roads and rivers that guided or trapped tens of thousands of soldiers in a shrinking space. Chambois, a small commune in the Orne department, would become known as the northern hinge of the closing pocket. Sit for a moment with the image of it as it existed in those August days, a modest Norman village of perhaps a few hundred souls, stone buildings of cream and grey, surrounded by the undulating farmland that characterizes the bocage, that dense network of small fields divided by ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes. The bocage had already shaped the Normandy campaign in its earlier phases, creating a landscape of concealment and close-quarters combat, a world where visibility measured in yards rather than miles. But at Chambois, the terrain began to open slightly, the hedgerows becoming less impenetrable and roads converging toward a crucial crossroads. The village itself sat upon gentle high ground, nothing dramatic, nothing like a proper mountain stronghold, but enough elevation to grant observation across surrounding fields. From the high ground near Chambois, one could see in most directions the patchwork of Norman agriculture, the grey-green summer crops, the lines of trees marking property boundaries and stream courses. Just to the south and east lay Trun, another village, even smaller, straddling the road that connected the pocket's interior to the narrowing corridor of escape. Trun occupied a valley floor, nestled against a watercourse that would become increasingly significant as German forces attempted movement through the shrinking gap. The road through Trun ran north and south, an arterial route for transport, for the flow of military traffic, for any attempt at organized retreat. It was precisely this geography, a village in a valley bottleneck, that made Trun's location so strategically loaded, so freighted with consequence. When the pocket began to close, roads through villages like Trun became simultaneously lifelines and death traps. A vehicle moving through Trun in daylight hours would be exposed, vulnerable to fire from elevated positions, visible to Allied artillery spotters and aircraft circling above. And then, some distance to the east, the river Dives, a modest watercourse by European standards, but one that would become a final barrier in the Germans' desperate attempts to break free. Along its course sat Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, perched on the riverbank itself, a village of scattered houses and small holdings. The river beside it neither particularly wide nor particularly deep, yet undeniably present, a line of division between enclosed space and the possibility of open country beyond. The Dives had always been there, of course, flowing quietly through the Norman landscape for centuries, but in August 1944, this narrow river became something else entirely, a moat in a closing fortress, the final geographic impediment between trapped German forces and the open road toward the Seine and the east. The terrain of the pocket, when viewed from above on a contemporary map, presents itself as a roughly oval or diamond-shaped region of perhaps 15 to 20 miles across at its widest, bounded to the north and west by the retreating German lines, and increasingly, from south and east, by converging Allied positions. The bocage continued throughout much of this region, those sunken lanes and dense hedgerows that had characterized so much of the Normandy fighting. But here is a peculiarity of the geography that would shape the coming crisis. The land itself seemed almost to narrow as one moved eastward and southward within the pocket. The roads that converged from the wider region to the north and west into the narrowing corridor towards Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives created, almost inadvertently, a natural funnel. A German soldier or vehicle attempting to move south or east had progressively fewer routing options, fewer parallel roads, fewer detours around blocked passages. The very roads that might have offered alternative routes became increasingly exposed, increasingly vulnerable to Allied observation and fire. The rivers added their own constraints, the Dives to the east, certainly, but also the Toux to the north, the Orne itself threading through various sections of the pocket. A soldier or vehicle column moving through bocage terrain with limited road options and major watercourses creating barriers, this is a recipe for concentration, for the gathering of forces into ever narrower channels. It is almost as if the landscape conspired, in the most neutral and indifferent way, toward the encirclement of vast numbers of men and machines. Did the German planners grasp, in early August, that the very terrain which had given them such tactical advantages in earlier weeks of defensive fighting would, once the Allied armies achieved breakthrough, become a prison? The bocage that had allowed smaller German forces to hold far more numerous attackers at bay, through concealment and the channelization of assault, this same bocage would now work against them, limiting mobility, restricting escape routes, creating zones where concentrated forces could be devastated by artillery and air attack. The topography, too, merits attention. The Normandy countryside rises and falls in gentle undulations, rarely steep, rarely dramatic, but enough to create sightlines, to allow the positioning of artillery batteries on high ground from which they could rain shells down upon the roads below. The villages of Chambois and Trun, and the river crossing at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, occupied positions, then, that were not merely locations, but nodes, in a network of terrain-based advantage and disadvantage. An army attempting to move through such country rapidly, without proper air cover, without freedom of maneuver, faces a particular kind of jeopardy. The landscape, which had seemed so familiar to the German soldiers who had held France for 4 years, now began to feel confining, limiting, almost suffocating in its constraints. Consider the experience of a Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS officer tasked with organizing retreat through such terrain. The roads were limited, congested, exposed. Daylight movement risked catastrophic losses to air attack. Night movement in unfamiliar country, without proper reconnaissance, risked getting lost, taking wrong turns, stumbling into Allied positions. The bocage, with its dense vegetation and sunken lanes, offered concealment, certainly, but also confusion, easy to lose direction, easy to become separated from one's unit. And when officers tried to establish defensive lines to hold open the corridor of escape, they found themselves working with a landscape that did not naturally favor strong defensive positions. The gentle undulations allowed the established positions to be outflanked. The villages, though they provided some structural advantage, were surrounded by open farmland that could be traversed, with difficulty, but traversed nonetheless. The Falaise pocket, then, was not simply a matter of military forces and strategic decisions. It was geography, ancient geology expressed as hedgerows and valleys, watercourses and villages, roads and high ground, interacting with modern warfare, with thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles attempting to navigate or escape through a landscape that was progressively closing around them. The Norman countryside, so pastoral in appearance, so ordered by centuries of human agricultural work, became a maze and then a trap as the jaws of the Allied armies tightened around it. The commanders who shaped the Falaise pocket operated in a state of profound uncertainty, each receiving fragmentary reports that painted contradictory pictures of the same catastrophe unfolding across Normandy's undulating landscape. On the German side, General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge stood at the apex of this desperate command structure, a man who had spent weeks wrestling with orders that seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality he witnessed from his command posts. Von Kluge had been appointed to replace Erwin Rommel after the latter's injuries in early July, and he inherited not only a collapsing front, but also the paranoid suspicions of Adolf Hitler, who watched German operations from his distant headquarters at Rastenburg with a mixture of distrust and denial. The messages that reached von Kluge from Berlin were often late, frequently contradictory, and almost always demanding counterattacks that his exhausted divisions simply could not execute. Hitler had become convinced that the breakout occurring in Normandy presented an opportunity rather than a threat, imagining that German armor could somehow sweep westward and sever the narrow corridor through which the American armies had poured after the liberation of Saint-Lô. This vision, compelling in its boldness to those who studied maps in comfortable headquarters, bore little resemblance to the experience of panzer grenadiers moving through a landscape that had become lethal with Allied fighters and bombers. Von Kluge found himself caught between the impossible demands of his political master and the grinding reality of officers reporting fuel shortages, casualty rates that left divisions at half strength, and supply lines that seemed to dissolve under the constant pressure of air attack. Beneath von Kluge, in the hierarchy of German command, lay a network of divisional and corps commanders, many of them aristocratic career officers shaped by the old Prussian military tradition, others hardened ideologues of the Waffen-SS, who viewed the war through a fundamentally different lens. The SS division Das Reich, commanded by Sturmbannführer Otto Kumm, and the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, led by Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke, represented this particular strain of Nazi military culture. These men had often risen through the ranks of the SS, bound by oath and ideology to the regime in ways that purely military officers sometimes were not. Yet even among the most committed Nazi commanders, a creeping awareness began to infiltrate their consciousness as August wore on, a quiet acknowledgement, rarely voiced aloud, that the strategic situation had become untenable. The communication channels through which these men received and transmitted information operated under conditions of increasing chaos. Radio operators struggled to maintain contact as mobile units scattered across a shrinking perimeter. Messengers on motorcycles navigated roads that had become shooting galleries for Allied fighters. The telephone lines that had once connected German headquarters to subordinate commands were frequently cut, leaving officers to make critical decisions in isolation, acting on information that might already be hours old. Some commanders received direct orders to hold territory that they could already see being overrun. Others, making independent judgments about withdrawal and regrouping, would later discover that Berlin had expected them to maintain positions that were no longer on any map corresponding to physical reality. The Allied command structure, while generally operating with superior coordination and communication, was nonetheless caught in its own web of uncertainty and misinterpretation. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British and Canadian forces from his tactical headquarters, believed at various points during late August that the German pocket was both more desperate and more capable of breaking out than it actually was. General Courtney Hodges of the American First Army received reports that sometimes suggested the Germans were collapsing entirely, while other messages indicated that organized panzer divisions were attempting to push eastward. General Henry Crerar, commanding the Canadian First Army, coordinated with Polish commanders whose divisions had only recently arrived from Britain and were operating in terrain that was foreign to them in every sense, both literally and in terms of tactical experience against German armor. The question of who held the final authority to close the Falaise pocket became increasingly murky as the situation developed. Was it Montgomery's decision, Hodges' prerogative, the judgment of subordinate corps commanders who found themselves in the vicinity of potential blocking positions? In the event, decisions that would have vast consequences for the number of Germans who escaped were often made by relatively junior officers commanding divisional or regimental forces, men who were focused on their immediate tactical problems and could not possibly have understood the strategic implications of their choices to hold certain crossings, to advance at particular speeds, or to concentrate forces at specific locations. The fog of war, a phrase sometimes used carelessly in historical discussion, becomes, in the case of Falaise, something almost tangible, almost visible in the confusion of the documented orders and countermands that flowed through the channels of command. A German general received orders at 3 in the afternoon that were already obsolete by sunset. An American division commander was told to advance to a particular objective, only to find that his flanking units had misunderstood the timing and left gaps through which German vehicles could slip. Polish tanks moved forward with incomplete intelligence about what they might encounter. Canadian infantry received contradictory guidance about where the front line actually was, because the front line existed primarily in reports and maps rather than in any fixed, clearly understood reality. Within this atmosphere of fragmented information and competing orders, individual commanders had to make decisions that would determine whether thousands of men lived or died, whether equipment worth enormous resources was preserved or destroyed, whether the Allies could truly achieve the encirclement they believed they were constructing, or whether they would find themselves holding the rim of an escape hatch that too many Germans managed to slip through. Von Kluge, knowing that his own communications were being intercepted by the Allies, had to assume that his orders were already known to his opponents before subordinates even received them. The German generals received fragments of information about Allied positions that suggested sometimes that the ring was open in certain sectors, yet by the time any unit reached those sectors, the gaps had either closed or never actually existed in the form reported. The psychological weight of operating under these conditions wore on commanders in ways that went beyond mere professional stress. These were men accustomed to clarity of purpose and hierarchy, yet they found themselves operating in circumstances where clarity dissolved almost the moment it seemed to crystallize. How does a commander maintain morale among troops who are receiving contradictory signals about whether they are breaking out, holding a line, or being sacrificed? How does a general transmit authoritative orders when he himself possesses only partial knowledge of the situation and receives updates that sometimes contradict reports received only hours earlier? Some commanders responded by attempting to maintain rigid discipline and order, believing that coherence in the chain of command might compensate for the lack of coherence in the actual tactical situation. Others began to improvise, making local decisions that departed from higher-level orders because the higher-level orders no longer matched observable reality. A few experienced what might be called a kind of professional despair, recognizing that no amount of skill or commitment could overcome the fundamental problem that the armies under their command were beginning to be surrounded by superior forces with superior means of communication, coordination, and firepower. Yet the machinery of command continued to turn, orders continued to be given, and underneath all of this chaos and confusion, hundreds of thousands of individual soldiers were preparing to move, to fight, to attempt impossible things, in hope that somehow clarity would emerge from the confusion. The August sun rose higher each day over the Norman bocage, and with it came a new presence that the German commanders had learned to dread, the sound of engines, first distant, then overwhelming, turning the very sky into a weapon. By the middle of the month, Allied air superiority had become so complete that moving by daylight was no longer a calculated risk, but rather an act of almost certain destruction. The Luftwaffe, stretched across the entire Western Front and beyond, could offer only scattered resistance, and the German commanders knew this truth in their bones, even as they attempted maneuver and retreat. What had begun in early August as a tactical problem had, by the time of the encirclement, become an existential crisis. The American 8th Air Force, the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Force, and Canadian squadrons operated in a coordinated dance above the countryside, their pilots flying sortie after sortie with a methodical precision that left little room for escape. Imagine the perspective of a German column commander, perhaps a weary Hauptsturmführer leading a motorized unit of Waffen-SS infantry, with trucks laden with ammunition and fuel that were themselves targets, watching the horizon for the telltale specks that meant death from above. The decision to move became a gamble, with mathematics favoring only the most pessimistic calculations. The fighter bombers came in waves, sometimes singly, sometimes in formations that blotted out the sun. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8 machine guns and capacity for bombs and rockets, had become the nightmare of any German transport driver who dared to venture onto the roads during daylight. The British Typhoon, equally feared, carried rockets that could pierce armor and shred vehicles with extraordinary lethality. These were not the precision instruments of later aerial warfare, they were blunt, overwhelming instruments of destruction, and they were everywhere. One might imagine the psychological weight of knowing that at any moment, without warning, the sky itself could become deadly. What made the air campaign particularly devastating in the pocket's final days was not merely the number of sorties, though there were thousands, but rather their concentration. As the Germans tried to funnel troops and equipment through the narrowing corridor toward freedom, the columns became denser, more compressed, easier targets. A single flight of 8 Thunderbolts, arriving at the right moment over a road clogged with trucks and half-tracks, could destroy dozens of vehicles in minutes. The roads became lined with burned-out hulks, twisted metal, overturned carts, and the debris of a retreat that no amount of courage or discipline could overcome. The air attacks followed a grinding rhythm. Dawn patrols would emerge as soon as visibility permitted, checking roads and villages for movement. Midday brought the heaviest attacks, when the sun was high and visibility optimal. Dusk offered brief respite, a moment when pilots had to return to their bases, and darkness finally granted some safety. The German soldiers learned this rhythm as children learn the rhythm of day and night, and they planned their movements accordingly. But as the pocket contracted, even the hours of relative safety proved insufficient. There was simply too much distance to cover, too many troops to move, too much equipment to evacuate, and always, the clock was running against them. Consider the specific mechanics of destruction. A flight of P-47s, carrying 8 rockets each in their wing pods, could approach a road at low altitude, sometimes just 50 or 100 feet above the ground, where anti-aircraft fire was intense but accuracy was difficult. The rockets, once fired, would streak toward their targets with a sound like tearing cloth, and where they struck, they left craters and fire. A truck, loaded with ammunition, might explode in a fireball visible for miles. A tank, hit in the engine compartment, might burn for hours, the crew escaping if they were fortunate enough to react quickly. The sight and sound of these attacks created a psychological pressure that was nearly as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers who survived them sometimes spoke decades later of the helplessness, the inability to fight back effectively against an enemy in the sky. The ground-based anti-aircraft defenses that the Germans could muster were significant but ultimately inadequate. The 20mm flak guns, the 37mm and 40mm pieces scattered throughout the pocket, were crewed by soldiers who were often exhausted and running short of ammunition. They achieved successes. Aircraft were shot down, though far fewer than the Germans would have wished, but for every plane lost, dozens more continued their grim work. The mathematics of attrition always favored the Allies, who had the production capacity to replace losses and rotate rested pilots. The Germans had no such luxury. What perhaps deserves reflection is the cumulative effect of these air attacks on the morale and cohesion of the German forces. Soldiers who had endured weeks of ground combat, who had retreated step by step across the Norman countryside, who were already demoralized by the encirclement itself, now faced the additional burden of constant threat from above. Officers found their orders increasingly difficult to execute because movement had become so perilous. Supply lines that were already fragile were shattered entirely. Reinforcements and ammunition that were desperately needed could not reach the front lines because any attempt to transport them resulted in destruction. The air campaign, in essence, was doing the work of the advancing ground armies, weakening German resistance and hastening the collapse of the pocket. In some instances, German units attempted to move vehicles during darkness and hide them during the day beneath trees and buildings, creating a kind of nocturnal existence that was its own form of exhaustion. Pilots from the Allied air forces, when they could not find moving targets during the day, would hunt for these hidden positions, bombing suspected assembly areas and village streets. The landscape itself became treacherous, every road a potential killing ground, every village square a target, every open field lethal. The thought occurs, how many soldiers made the decision to abandon their vehicles and attempt escape on foot simply because the alternative, attempting to drive those vehicles anywhere, seemed tantamount to suicide. The coordination between Allied ground forces and air power, though certainly not perfect, gave the advancing armies an advantage that was difficult for the Germans to counter. Forward air controllers, traveling with or near the leading units, could radio coordinates of German positions to waiting aircraft, and within minutes, fighter bombers would appear. This partnership meant that the Germans could rarely rest, rarely consolidate positions, rarely achieve the kind of temporary advantage that might have allowed them to coordinate an effective counterattack or organized retreat. Instead, they found themselves in constant motion, constantly pressured from the air, constantly losing vehicles and men and ammunition to attacks they could not prevent or adequately resist. The role of weather, too, must be acknowledged. On days when clouds covered the sky, when visibility was poor, the air attacks slowed considerably, sometimes stopped entirely. The German soldiers and commanders might speak in hushed tones of a coming rain, of cloud cover that might offer respite. These moments, when the sky turned grey and the threat from above diminished, became precious, almost sacred interludes. Veterans would remember them with the same kind of reverence that a person lost in a desert might remember the sudden arrival of shade. But the respite was always temporary. The clouds would part, the sun would emerge again, and with it, like a hunting animal returning to its prey, would come the sound of aircraft engines. By the final days of August, the accumulated effect of the air campaign had become nearly total. The roads were essentially unusable during daylight hours. The pockets roads, narrow, winding, lined with vegetation and buildings that offered minimal shelter, had become killing zones where the only survival strategy was to abandon vehicles and attempt passage on foot, scattered in small groups, moving through forests and across fields, away from any route that a pilot in the sky might recognize as a column or a convoy. In this way, the Allied air forces had accomplished something remarkable. They had transformed the geography of the pocket itself into an instrument of German defeat, making the very roads that offered the only hope of escape into paths of destruction. By the third week of August, as the perimeter tightened around the German forces trapped within the Falaise pocket, existence for the soldiers caught inside had become something far removed from the organized warfare of the previous weeks. The reality of encirclement, once a distant calculation on a general's map, had transformed into a suffocating daily reality of scarcity, exhaustion, and the peculiar terror that comes from knowing escape routes are narrowing by the hour. The Waffen-SS divisions, those mechanized units that had prided themselves on speed and striking power, found themselves in a landscape where neither speed nor power seemed to matter anymore. Fuel was becoming the most precious commodity on the battlefield, more valuable in some moments than ammunition itself. A panzer crew might have shells in their magazine, but nowhere to go with the machine that fired them. Trucks sat abandoned or were cannibalized for parts. Officers ordered soldiers to drain the last dregs of petrol from vehicles no longer running, transferring it into jerry cans that would be carried forward by exhausted men on foot. The logistics that had kept an army moving had simply collapsed, starved of supply lines that could no longer function under constant air bombardment. Think for a moment about what that particular hunger means. Not hunger for food, though that was real enough, but hunger for fuel. In modern war, especially in 1944, an army without fuel is not merely slowed, it is transformed into something else entirely. Mobility becomes memory. A tank becomes a pillbox. A transport column becomes a target that cannot move and therefore cannot survive the next strafing run. The Waffen-SS soldiers who had known the exhilaration of rapid advance, of moving ahead of the enemy's ability to respond, now watched their mechanical advantages drain away into the Norman soil. Food, too, was becoming irregular. Supply trucks that might have delivered rations no longer came. What food remained was distributed sparingly, and soldiers learned to eke out their portions across longer hours. Canned meat and hard biscuits became precious items traded and bartered. Water was plentiful enough, at least, in the Norman landscape with its streams and rivers, though drinking from questionable sources brought its own misery. Many men suffered from dysentery and stomach complaints, weakening them further, making the long marches that lay ahead seem even more daunting. The ammunition situation was perhaps the most psychologically corrosive of all. A soldier with a rifle or a machine gun is still a soldier, still capable of fighting, still armed against fear. But a soldier rationed to 10 rounds when combat might demand 50 comes to understand that his weapon is almost decorative. Officers issued orders to conserve ammunition, to use it only when the shot was nearly certain, to rely more on grenades and close combat. This rationing of firepower had a peculiar effect on morale. It whispered constantly that time was running out, that the battle was already being lost in the ledgers of supply depots. The physical exhaustion cannot be overstated. These men had been fighting continuously for more than 2 months since D-Day. Their bodies had known little rest and no comfort. Trenches, hasty fortifications, constant repositioning as the line compressed. All of this was conducted while running on depleted reserves of human endurance. Sleep came in brief fragments, often interrupted by air raids or the need to move to new positions. When men did manage to rest, they found themselves waking suddenly to the sound of artillery or the distinctive roar of Typhoon fighter bombers diving toward German columns. The psychological weight of encirclement, though, was perhaps heavier than any physical burden. Soldiers understood, with the instinctive clarity that men facing death possess, that they were trapped. The front lines that had once been places where you could advance or retreat, where there were flanks and approaches and tactical options, had contracted into something else. A pocket, a shrinking circle. The perimeter that had been perhaps 30 or 40 kilometers across on August 15th was, by August 18th, barely half that distance. By August 19th, it was smaller still. The psychological mathematics were simple and relentless. Some men held on to the hope that senior commanders had a plan, that this apparent disaster was merely a temporary setback, that reinforcements or a breakthrough was coming. Others, particularly those who could read maps or who overheard fragments of officer conversations, began to grasp that the situation was close to hopeless. This created a strange split in the psychology of the pocket. Hope and despair existed simultaneously in the same unit, sometimes in the same man's heart hour by hour. Letters written during this period, preserved in archives across Germany and Austria, reveal men struggling to make sense of their circumstances. One can read between the lines of a Waffen-SS infantryman writing to his mother, carefully censored, carefully controlled to avoid alarming the censors, a deep weariness and an unspoken knowledge that the war had fundamentally changed. The rhetoric of victory that had characterized earlier letters gave way to a quieter, more introspective tone. References to the quality of comrades, to acts of courage witnessed, to the strangeness of the landscape, the writing of men beginning to suspect they might not survive. The physical appearance of soldiers deteriorated noticeably over these few days of August. Photographs taken by both German and Allied photographers during this period show faces hollowed by stress and hunger, uniforms filthy and torn, eyes carrying a particular kind of glazed exhaustion that goes beyond mere tiredness. These were men whose reserves of physical and mental resilience were being depleted in real time. Shaving became a luxury, and most men went unshaven, their chins darkening day by day. Uniform insignia, once kept polished despite the mud of combat, went neglected. The small rituals of military order, the things that help maintain morale and identity, began to slip away. Interestingly, or perhaps it should say troublingly, unit cohesion during this period remained relatively strong. This might seem counterintuitive, one might expect that trapped and deprived men would turn on each other, that order would collapse into chaos. But the reality was often different. The Waffen-SS, despite its terrible history and ideology, was in practical terms a disciplined military force where many men had trained together for months or even years. In the face of shared threat and shared suffering, that bond often held. Men who had fought alongside each other through Normandy's bocage were not suddenly going to abandon their unit mates. If anything, the tightening noose seemed to strengthen the bonds between soldiers who shared the same fate. The question of what was coming next hung over every moment. German soldiers had heard rumors about the treatment of prisoners, conflicting stories about what happened to captured men. Some held on to Geneva Convention assumptions. Others suspected that as an elite SS unit, they might face harsher treatment than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. The psychological state of a man contemplating surrender while fearing what might await him in captivity is difficult to fully inhabit unless one has lived through it. It creates a peculiar paralysis, a state where continuing to fight seems almost preferable to the unknown that awaits if the fighting stops. The landscape itself, the Norman fields and villages around the shrinking perimeter, took on a strange character as the pocket compressed. The villages that had been occupied for weeks had become ruins. Chambois, which would become the focal point of the final struggle, was already heavily damaged. Trun and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, small rural communities that had known centuries of peace, had become battlegrounds where shells and tank fire had torn apart stone buildings. The roads that German columns needed to use to escape were littered with abandoned vehicles, destroyed tanks, and the detritus of military collapse. What had once been farmland was now scarred with shell craters and the dark stains of burned grass and spilled fuel. The relationship between the soldiers and these devastated places was strange and worth contemplating. These were not soldiers in their homeland. They were invaders in a foreign country that was being systematically liberated from their occupation. The despair they felt about their own situation coexisted uneasily with the knowledge that the population around them was celebrating, or soon would be celebrating, their departure. There is something particularly demoralizing about being trapped in territory where the civilian population regards your presence as an occupation to be ended, where the liberation being celebrated is your defeat. Some German soldiers maintained their discipline and sense of order despite this. Others felt the weight of that knowledge deeply. By the 19th of August, perhaps the most difficult day psychologically, the perimeter was so compressed that soldiers could hear not only the constant rumble of artillery, but also, in quieter moments, the sounds of the Allied forces surrounding them. The crack of small arms fire, the distinctive sound of English and Canadian voices calling out, the rumble of tank engines. The sense of being surrounded shifted from a strategic concept to an immediate, almost claustrophobic reality. A soldier looking toward any horizon saw potential enemies. The safe areas were shrinking to nothing. Even the act of moving through the pocket from one position to another was becoming increasingly dangerous, as artillery fire and airstrikes could come from any direction. The decisions that commanders faced were no easier than those faced by the ordinary soldiers. Officers of the Waffen-SS, men who had been trained to pursue aggressive tactics and breakthrough operations, now had to manage the morale of trapped men while contemplating how to save at least some of their units. These were often contradictory goals. Attempting to break out would surely result in heavy casualties, but remaining in place meant capture or death as the perimeter compressed further. The weight of command in such circumstances, knowing that whatever decision you make, men under your responsibility will die, is a particular form of psychological torment that history often passes over too quickly. As evening fell on each day of this final week, men wrote letters they knew might never be sent, composed thoughts about home, contemplated the fragility of existence. The sound of artillery became so constant that silence was actually more frightening than the noise of bombardment. When the guns fell quiet, soldiers braced themselves, knowing that the silence often meant something worse was coming. The psychology of constant threat, where even respite becomes cause for anxiety, wore away at men's resilience like water-wearing stone. This was the reality of the Falaise pocket in its final chapter, not the grand narrative of strategic collapse that generals and historians discuss, but the intimate, grinding reality of ordinary men compressed into a shrinking space, running out of fuel, ammunition, and hope, waiting to see what came next, and knowing, with a knowledge that transcended rational analysis, that when the final moment arrived, it would arrive suddenly and would change everything. By the early morning hours of August 15th, the walls of the pocket had begun to move inward with a kind of inexorable slowness, as though the Allied armies were closing their hands around something precious and fragile, drawing in tighter with each passing hour. The geography of escape, which had seemed almost possible just days before, was narrowing into what some German commanders would later describe as a corridor of despair, a strip of farmland and forest roads that would soon become impossible to traverse without encountering advancing formations from 3, sometimes 4 different nations. The Canadians, having fought their way south from the beaches with steady, grinding determination, were now pushing eastward with a clarity of purpose. Their advance was methodical rather than rapid, but it was this very methodicalness that made it so difficult to outrun. They had learned through hard experience in Normandy that speed invited counterattack, that exposure invited casualties. So they moved with deliberation, securing each village, each crossroads, each stretch of bocage before advancing further. By August 16th and 17th, Canadian forces were bearing down on the towns of Falaise itself and the villages that lay in the southern and eastern reaches of the forming pocket: Rouen, Trun, the approaches to Chambois. Can you imagine perhaps the psychological weight that this steady advance must have carried? Not through sudden violence, but through the knowledge that somewhere ahead of you, your enemy was running out of places to run. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, operating under Canadian command, was moving with particular urgency. These were soldiers fighting not only for military victory, but for something deeper, for Poland, for the liberation of their homeland from the east, for the vindication of a nation that had endured so much. They had landed in Normandy only weeks before, and they were eager to prove themselves, to make their contribution felt in this climactic moment of the campaign. Their movement northward and eastward was creating a second wall of the closing trap, and soldiers in their ranks knew that they were part of something historically significant, even if the full scale of it would not become clear until later. From the west and south, American forces under General Omar Bradley were tightening their grip with a different character altogether. The Americans had suffered enormously in the hedgerow fighting around Saint-Lô and Mortain, and they had learned that the German army, even when apparently defeated and in retreat, remained capable of sudden, vicious counterattacks. So the American advance was cautious, supported by overwhelming firepower, and coordinated with meticulous attention to preventing German breakout attempts. The 90th Infantry Division, the 35th Infantry Division, and various supporting units were moving with steady purpose, their movements often occurring under cover of darkness or in the early hours before dawn, when German air observation was least likely. The coordination between American formations and the broader pocket-closing operation required constant communication, constant adjustments to the plan, and a kind of trust between officers that could only come from shared experience. The British forces, meanwhile, were engaged in their own grinding advance from the northwest, having fought through the bocage and the villages of the Norman interior. They were moving with the kind of measured precision that British commanders preferred, always ensuring that supply lines were secure, that flanks were protected, that the advance maintained its cohesion, even as the space available for maneuver grew smaller and smaller. General Bernard Montgomery, overseeing the entire operation, was determined that this encirclement would be complete, that no significant German force would slip through the closing net, that the victory in Normandy would be not merely a beachhead secured, but a strategic turning point of the entire campaign. What emerges from the historical record when you read the accounts of officers and men from all these advancing formations is a sense of creeping tension and rising anticipation. The pocket was not yet completely closed. There remained, until August 19th and even 20th, a corridor, albeit a narrowing one, through which German forces might attempt to escape. But with each passing day, with each village captured, each road cut, each river crossing secured, that corridor grew smaller. For the Germans caught inside, the sense of time running out must have been almost palpable, an invisible pressure that mounted with each dawn, each fresh report of Allied positions drawing closer. The terrain itself played its role in this tightening. The roads around Falaise, Chambois, and the smaller villages formed a kind of web, with certain routes being more passable than others, certain bottlenecks more inevitable than others. Commanders on both sides understood these geographical constraints intimately. They knew which roads could support heavy vehicles, which could support only light trucks, which might become impassable if unusually heavy rain fell. The river crossings, particularly the Dives River, became focal points in the minds of planners and soldiers alike. If you could block the Dives crossings, you could seal the fate of any force still trapped on the western side of that waterline. This is what the Polish and Canadian commanders understood with increasing clarity as August progressed. The movement of forces into position to close the pocket involved a kind of choreography that required perfect timing and coordination across multiple army groups, multiple nations, and commanders who did not always share the same language or the same tactical doctrines. Yet somehow, through radio messages, through liaison officers moving between headquarters, through the coordination of supply lines and ammunition dumps, through the movement of engineers to clear routes and prepare bridges, this choreography was being executed. It was not always smooth. There were moments of confusion, instances where units fired on one another, delays caused by traffic congestion or unexpected German resistance. But the overall pattern was unmistakable. The net was drawing in. For the soldiers in the advancing formations, the Canadian infantryman moving through a smoke-filled village, the Polish tanker grinding forward in his armored vehicle, the American rifleman advancing from hedgerow to hedgerow, the British sappers working to clear mines from a newly captured road, there was a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Exhaustion because they had been fighting now for weeks without significant rest, because the bocage fighting had consumed enormous amounts of energy and casualties, because the advance into the pocket meant moving into areas where German resistance could appear from any direction. But exhilaration too, because there was a sense that the campaign was reaching its culmination, that the seemingly invincible German army was now being compressed into an ever smaller space, that victory, whatever form it would take, was approaching. The nights during this period took on a particular character. Under the cover of darkness, German forces would attempt to move within the pocket, to reposition units, to find better defensive lines, to prepare for escape attempts. But the advance of Allied forces meant that these movements became increasingly constrained. A unit that attempted to move east on one road might find that Allied forces had already advanced to block that road. A retreat planned for a particular direction might prove impossible because Canadian or American units had already moved into that area. The fog of war, which had been such a feature of the earlier Normandy campaign, was gradually lifting, not completely, never completely in war, but enough that commanders were beginning to understand the true shape of the situation. By August 18th and 19th, the eastern approaches to the pocket had been largely sealed. The Polish 1st Armoured Division was closing in on the hill positions that would become the critical strongpoint of Hill 262, Mont-Ormel. Canadian forces were drawing near to Chambois. The roads between these positions were becoming choked with retreating German vehicles, with columns that were desperate to move north and east before the final exits were closed. Can you picture it? The roads themselves becoming bottlenecks, the very escape routes that commanders were hoping to navigate, transformed into deadly corridors where every vehicle was vulnerable, where every moment of delay could be fatal. The tightening of the noose was not a matter of sudden, dramatic encirclement. Rather, it was a grinding, methodical process in which the available space for German maneuver contracted day by day, hour by hour. It was a process driven not by single dramatic moments, but by the cumulative effect of thousands of small decisions by junior officers, by the steady movement of troops across farmland and through villages, by the work of engineers clearing obstacles, by the supply convoys that kept the advancing armies moving forward. It was the kind of military operation that, when described in the official histories and the strategic analyses, sounds almost abstract, almost inevitable, as though the Germans had no choice but to be compressed into an ever smaller space. But for those living through it, both the trapped Germans and the encircling Allies, it was a process fraught with uncertainty, with individual moments of fear and courage, with the constant possibility that something might go wrong, that the pocket might break open, that the enemy might slip away. Beneath the larger maps and orders, beneath the calculations of division commanders and the arc of strategic encirclement, there lived another war altogether, one measured in the texture of fatigue, the weight of a letter not yet sent, the small rituals that kept a mind intact when surrounded. A German infantryman named Franz, records suggest, carried in his field pack a photograph of his sister taken in 1942, the edges now softened from handling. He had not received mail in 12 days. The photograph had become, in its way, more real to him than his own circumstances, and in the hours when the shelling paused and the noise of engines dimmed to something almost bearable, he would look at it and try to remember what his own voice sounded like saying her name. These small, almost invisible habits, the maintenance of love through objects, through memory, through the fierce discipline of not forgetting, became a kind of survival mechanism as the pocket tightened around him. Tank crews endured a particular species of claustrophobia. Imagine sitting in the metal hull of a Panzer V Panther, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel, hot grease, and the peculiar metallic taste that comes from breathing the same recycled air as 5 other men for 16 hours. The radio operator, a boy of 19 named Klaus from Stuttgart, would sometimes press his headphones against his ears simply to have the sensation of being compressed, to feel that at least some boundary existed between himself and the vast, incomprehensible chaos outside the armor. When shells struck nearby, the tank would ring like a struck bell, and for a moment, suspended in that sound, the crew would forget to breathe. Letters home were written with a particular desperation as the days grew shorter. A Panzer Grenadier called Otto sat near a farmhouse wall one evening, his pencil moving slowly across paper he had stolen from an abandoned schoolhouse. The letter was not remarkable. He wrote that he was well, that the food was adequate, that he thought often of harvest time in his village and wondered if his father's wheat would survive the coming winter. He did not write that he had seen 3 men burned to death that morning. He did not write that he no longer believed they would leave this place alive, that the geometry of the pocket had become a kind of inevitable closing fist. Instead, he wrote small truths nested inside larger silences. He wrote what a man must write when he is trying to preserve, for those he loves, the image of himself as someone who might still come home. The psychological weight of encirclement cannot be overstated. There is a particular terror in knowing the walls are closing, in watching the map grow smaller, in hearing rumors that filter through the ranks, some true, most catastrophically false. A Waffen-SS sergeant named Ernst, who kept a journal in the margins of an old military handbook, wrote on August 19th, "The radio speaks of relief columns, of breakthrough operations to the east. No one believes this anymore. We believe only what we see, and what we see is ourselves, waiting." The waiting itself became a form of torture. What would happen? Would they be overrun? Would they be ordered to fight to the last man? Would they somehow, impossibly, slip through? In these gaps between orders and events, men invented small moments of grace. A medic named Werner shared his last packet of cigarettes with 6 others, sitting in a trench as the light failed. They did not speak much. Conversation had become difficult. Words seemed to fail in the presence of the obvious, the unsayable truth of their circumstance. Instead, they smoked, and in the sharing of something finite and precious, there was a kind of communion, a wordless acknowledgement that they were still, despite everything, men capable of kindness. Another crew, this one from a reconnaissance unit, found a family's butter and bread hidden in a cellar beneath a ruined farmhouse. They had been ordered not to forage, to preserve supplies for the fighting, but hunger had become its own authority. They sat, surrounded by the evidence of other people's lives, a child's wooden toy, a prayer book with a woman's name inscribed on the inside, and they ate. The butter was sweet in a way that seemed almost obscene, too rich for men who had grown accustomed to hardtack and ersatz coffee. For perhaps 30 minutes, as they sat in that cellar in the gathering dark, they were not soldiers in a pocket, not men waiting to be killed or captured. They were simply hungry men who had found food, and in that ordinary human transaction, there was a kind of redemption, however brief. The passage of time moved strangely. Hours felt like days, and days collapsed into a kind of eternal present. A tank gunner named Friedrich, writing what would be found among his personal effects after the war, described August 16th as lasting perhaps 100 hours. The sun rose and set, but did not seem to move across the sky. The radius of the pocket grew smaller every few hours. First, you could walk to the edge in 40 minutes, then 20, then 10. Officers and men alike struggled to process the acceleration of their own diminishment. What perhaps deserves gentle attention is the question of how ordinary soldiers, men conscripted or ideologically committed, men shaped by a state and a propaganda, responded when that state's promises of invincibility evaporated into smoke. Some broke. Some retreated into numbness. Others, inexplicably, seemed to find clarity in the collapse. A letter, discovered decades later in an archive, written by a soldier named Martin to his wife, contains this passage. "The world has been much larger than we were told. I understand this now. I wish I had understood it earlier, but I will not die bitter, and I will not die hating. If I die, and if you receive this, know that I tried to be good even here, even now." That letter never reached his wife. But he had written it, and in writing it, he had claimed something that the collapse of armies could not take from him: the human capacity to maintain interior life, to preserve love and hope and even humor in circumstances designed to obliterate all three, is perhaps the most underrated force in history. A group of men, waiting in a communications trench as dusk approached on August 18th, somehow began laughing, quietly at first, then harder, about nothing in particular, about a recalled joke from peacetime, about the absurdity of where they found themselves. Their sergeant did not reprimand them. He sat and listened, and perhaps he understood that this laughter, however brief, was as necessary as ammunition. The chaos surrounding them, the movement of tanks, the collapse of supply lines, the tightening grid of Allied forces, all of this was happening. It was real, and it was fatal. But within that chaos, carried by thousands of individual men, was also this: the memory of a sister's face, the taste of good butter, a letter begun and perhaps never completed, the warmth of shared cigarettes in the darkness, the defiant, incomprehensible persistence of love and humor in the presence of annihilation. When the sun dipped below the horizon on those August nights, the pocket seemed to transform into something altogether different. The daylight had brought the constant menace of Allied aircraft, the roar of engines overhead, the methodical destruction of anything that moved along the roads. But darkness offered something else. It offered a thin, trembling possibility. The German commanders inside the encirclement understood this with an almost desperate clarity. They knew their time was measured not in weeks or days, but in hours. The Americans had pushed from the south, the British and Canadians were grinding in from the north, and the Polish were holding firm on the high ground to the east. The corridor through which men and vehicles might still escape was narrowing with each passing moment, like a noose being drawn tighter by an invisible hand. Somewhere in those dark hours between dusk and dawn lay the only realistic chance for any organized withdrawal. So the orders went out, whispered from command posts, radioed to battalion leaders, passed down through exhausted NCOs to men who had been awake for days. When night falls, we move, quietly, quickly, stay off the main roads, move through the fields and the forests, use the valleys where the land dips away from Allied observation posts. There was no formal announcement of a general breakout, because such a thing would have been madness. Instead, there was a loose, desperate coordination, unit commanders making their own calculations about when and how to push their men northward through the remaining gap. The nights were not entirely dark, of course. August darkness in Normandy is never complete. The sky retains a faint luminescence even at its deepest, and the moon, when it rose, cast a silvery glow across the Norman bocage that was both beautiful and terrifying. That same light that revealed the contours of the land to soldiers desperate for safe passage also exposed them to any Allied soldier who happened to be watching, or listening, or simply alert in the darkness. Picture, if you will, the scene that repeated itself across those terrible nights. A column of trucks and half-tracks, and exhausted men on foot, moving as silently as thousands of people can move, which is to say, not very silently at all. There is the crunch of boots in dried grass, the occasional whisper of a command, the soft metallic sounds of equipment settling. There is the smell of unwashed men, of diesel fuel, of horses, because some units still relied on draft animals to pull their supply wagons, a remnant of an earlier era of warfare, now reduced to fleeing through darkness like ghosts. A soldier might think of home in such moments, or he might simply concentrate on placing one foot in front of the other, on not stumbling over the man in front of him, on not falling into a ditch that might conceal a waiting Allied patrol. The routes themselves became semi-legendary in the immediate aftermath of the battle, paths that were said to have been used repeatedly, though the exact locations of these corridors shifted from account to account. Through the village of Trun, which sat like a bottleneck in the landscape, along the river valleys, where the steep banks of the Dives and the Orne offered some shelter from observation, through patches of woodland, where the trees created a canopy that obscured movement from above and made artillery spotting more difficult. The Norman terrain, which had seemed so hostile during daylight, those dense hedgerows that could hide anti-tank guns, those narrow lanes where vehicles became vulnerable, now became something closer to an ally. A soldier moving through such landscape at night could disappear into shadow and texture in ways that would be impossible in the open fields around Falaise. But there was a crucial problem, one that perhaps could never be entirely solved, and that was the matter of coordination and intelligence. The Allies, with their superior communications systems and their air superiority, understood the general shape of what was happening. They knew that Germans would try to escape through the night. They couldn't be everywhere, couldn't watch every path, couldn't seal every gap, but they could position forces in the most likely escape routes. They could order American and Canadian units to maintain alertness during night hours. They could set up roadblocks and listening posts, and they could do something that no German unit inside the pocket could do reliably. They could communicate with other Allied units to coordinate a response. So what unfolded in the darkness was a kind of desperate chess game played by men too tired to think clearly, across terrain too complex to map with perfect accuracy, under conditions of uncertainty that approached the chaotic. Some German columns moved through the darkness successfully, their men reaching areas where they could disperse into the countryside and attempt to make their way back toward German-held territory. The routes they took, assuming the various post-war accounts can be trusted, typically involved movements between 2 and 5 kilometers, though some longer passages were attempted as well. A soldier or a small unit, especially one that was not encumbered with heavy equipment, might realistically move between 5 and 10 kilometers in a night of careful travel, which meant that a journey from the center of the pocket to its northern edge might take 2 or 3 nights, or sometimes only 1, if luck was present and resistance was light. But luck, as it happened, was in short supply. Other columns ran directly into waiting Allied forces. There are accounts of ambushes in the darkness, of German trucks suddenly illuminated by gunfire, of confusion and panic as men tried to scatter from kill zones. There are stories of units that became so disoriented in the darkness that they ended up heading in the wrong direction entirely, away from the gap they were seeking, deeper into areas that were more heavily defended. One might wonder whether such mistakes were simple errors of navigation, which would be understandable enough given the stress and exhaustion involved, or whether they reflected something about the degradation of command and control that happened when organizations tried to function in extremis. The smaller groups, generally speaking, had better luck than the larger formations. A platoon or a company, moving quietly, keeping to the shadowed margins of fields, could navigate across several kilometers without encountering serious opposition. But a full battalion, let alone a regiment, was a vastly different problem. Such formations required coherence. They required the ability to move their vehicles along roads, or at least passable terrain. They required the maintenance of some kind of command structure, which meant officers and NCOs moving between groups, which meant noise and light, and an organizational footprint that was extremely difficult to hide. A horseman, or a messenger on foot, moving between units in darkness, risks wandering into a ditch or becoming lost. A radio transmission, however brief and encrypted, broadcasts the location of a unit to anyone listening on the right frequency. Every mechanism by which a large military formation tries to maintain its cohesion in darkness essentially advertises its presence. There emerged from this a kind of operational reality that was somewhat brutal. The larger, more organized units, which were theoretically more effective fighting forces and theoretically better positioned to achieve a coordinated breakout, were actually more vulnerable to being trapped and destroyed. A regiment attempting to move as a unit was an easier target than dozens of small groups dispersing into the darkness. The very organization that gave these men their collective power worked against them when the goal was invisibility and escape. Does this suggest something about the nature of military organization itself, perhaps? That in moments of acute crisis and collapse, the bonds that hold an army together can become liabilities rather than assets. The Waffen-SS units, being primarily mechanized formations, faced particular challenges. They had trucks and half-tracks and armored personnel carriers and tanks, the very mobility that had made them effective fighting forces in normal circumstances. But in the confined geography of the pocket, with Allied aircraft waiting for daylight and Allied ground forces positioned at critical points, these vehicles became conspicuous and vulnerable. A tank has certain advantages in combat, but noise and a thermal signature and an unmistakable profile are not among them when one is attempting a quiet escape through darkness. Officers debated whether to abandon vehicles and move on foot, a decision that would have meant losing their means of rapid transport, but would have increased individual soldiers' chances of escaping on their own, or to attempt to move the vehicles through the darkness despite the risks. Different units made different choices, and history does not record that any of these choices was clearly superior in outcome. As the nights progressed, as more columns attempted the escape, as the fighting around the pocket's edges grew more intense, a curious asymmetry developed in the nature of the conflict. During daylight, the Germans were at their weakest, exposed to air attack, vulnerable to the superior numbers of Allied infantry and armor moving to tighten the encirclement. During darkness, they had a genuine advantage, a window of opportunity in which the overwhelming firepower advantages of the Allies were negated. But that window was finite. Each night that passed meant that the pocket grew smaller, that fewer escape routes remained open, that Allied units had more time to dig in at critical points. The Germans were racing against a clock that was counting down toward a dawn that would bring not relief, but only renewed vulnerability. By the morning of August 16th, the walls of the pocket had begun to contract with a terrible inevitability, and what had been a broad, if precarious, corridor of retreat was tightening into something closer to a funnel. The roads leading westward toward the Seine, toward possible safety, were becoming choked not only with military traffic, but with a growing tide of French civilians who had begun to understand that they were trapped between two armies in a landscape that was about to become a furnace. And perhaps there was no place where this convergence of soldier and refugee, of desperate escape and desperate survival, became more concentrated and more nightmarish than at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. The small Norman village sits on a rise near the Dives River, and it occupied, almost by accident of geography, one of the very few viable crossing points for vehicles attempting to move through the pocket's shrinking perimeter. German commanders, in their last clear-headed calculations of August, had understood this about the terrain. They knew the river could be forded in only a handful of places, and they knew that wherever the Allies chose to seal the pocket, those river crossings would become the crucible, the place where escape would be either possible or impossible, where thousands might live or thousands might perish. St. Lambert was one such crossing, and as the 16th turned into the 17th, and the 17th into the 18th, the village itself became something between a battlefield and a refugee camp and an open grave. Can you imagine the sensory chaos of it? The roads narrow, often no wider than 20 feet or so, lined with high Norman hedgerows that seem to close in from both sides, that reduce visibility and fragment command and control into small, terrified bubbles of awareness. German columns, trucks, half-tracks, the occasional precious tank or self-propelled gun, are trying to force their way through, trying to reach the river before Canadian or Polish or American forces can seal the crossing entirely. But mixed among those military vehicles are now ox carts, bicycles, hand-drawn carts, piled with the salvaged remnants of homes. An elderly woman with grey hair pulled back, a child perched on a bundle of blankets. Farmers who never dreamed they would become part of a military catastrophe, whose property and lives had simply been consumed by the larger machinery of war. The Polish II Corps, driving south from Chambois, has begun to understand what is happening. They understand that if they can hold the Dives crossing for even a few hours more, if they can maintain pressure on what remains of the German columns, the trap will be complete. But the Germans are not going quietly. Waffen-SS units, hardened, desperate, aware that they are being hunted, have organized themselves into what fighting groups they can assemble from the wreckage of their formations. A Panther tank, its sides scarred and pocked with machine gun bullet holes, rumbles forward. Beside it, a convoy of trucks, perhaps carrying supplies, perhaps carrying wounded, perhaps carrying men too exhausted to walk any farther. The confusion is almost total. German officers are trying to direct traffic down roads that seem too small for the traffic they must bear. Allied artillery, ranging in from positions miles away, is dropping shells into the village itself, into the river, into the very crossings that German soldiers are desperately trying to use. There is smoke, thick and rolling, that rises from burning vehicles and makes it impossible to see more than 50 or 100 yards in any direction. A Polish reconnaissance patrol comes around a bend in the road and encounters, suddenly, a German half-track. For a moment, both sides seem frozen. Then the machine guns begin to fire. Someone is crying, and it is not clear whether it is a soldier or a civilian. Perhaps it is both. One can piece together from the accounts that survive, from diaries, from post-war interviews, from the careful work of historians who have walked these roads and talked to survivors, that the crossing itself became almost medieval in its desperation. Men were attempting to ford the river on foot while under fire. Vehicles were being driven through in shallow water, while artillery shells were landing in bursts around them. A German officer, somewhere in the chaos, made a decision. Perhaps it was the only decision left to make, to organize a rear-guard action. A few tanks, a few squads of SS infantry, would stay behind, would hold the crossing for as long as it was humanly possible, to buy time for the columns behind them. And what does that mean, in practical terms? It means that those men understood, with a clarity that cuts through all the historical distance, that they were probably not going to leave that village alive. The afternoon light of August 17th slanted across the roads at Falaise, at a particular angle that one finds in late summer in Normandy. The light is golden and soft, and it seems almost indecent that such beautiful light should illuminate such carnage. A truck loaded with ammunition is burning, and the smoke rises in thick, black columns that almost obscure the view of the river beyond. Canadian and Polish forces are tightening their grip. American forces are pushing up from the south and west. The pocket, which had been perhaps 20 miles across at its widest point just hours before, is now compressed into an area not much larger than a town, perhaps 5 miles across, with a corridor barely 2 or 3 miles wide. Inside that corridor, the civilian population of the region is experiencing something for which there is perhaps no adequate word. They are not soldiers. They have no weapons, no training, no orders. They are simply caught. Their homes are being used as strongpoints or blown to rubble. The roads they have lived on for generations are now rivers of mud and blood and smoke. A mother is trying to keep her children together while German soldiers are pushing past her, while Allied shells are landing nearby, while she is trying to reach some kind of safety that no longer seems to exist. These are the moments that history often glosses over. These are the moments that make war not an abstraction, but a reality of visceral horror that does not fit neatly into any strategic narrative. The mingling of the military and civilian populations in the pocket created confusion that cut both ways. It was difficult for Allied forces to distinguish between fleeing soldiers and fleeing civilians. A car with a white flag that appeared to carry evacuees might conceal German soldiers. A group of women and children on the road might be legitimate refugees, or might be cover for a German counterattack. This uncertainty, this constant ambiguity, meant that fire sometimes fell where it perhaps should not have fallen. And yet, one must note carefully, though it is a hard truth to contemplate, that much of the civilian death toll at Falaise came from Allied bombing and artillery, not from German actions. The Allies were trying to destroy German forces, and in doing so, they destroyed French lives as well. It is a tragedy that admits of no simple moral accounting. By the evening of August 17th, the pace of events was quickening. German units that had been relatively organized even a few days before were now fragmenting into smaller and smaller groups. A company of SS infantry became a platoon became a squad, officers were losing track of their men were losing track of their orders. All that remained was the ancient imperative of survival, the simple biological urge to move toward safety, to find a gap in the closing circle, to get across the river. The roads at Saint-Lambert, in that gathering dusk, were beginning to look less like a military position than like the floor of Bedlam, a place where human beings, both in uniform and out, were being compressed by forces beyond their control or understanding into an ever smaller space. And everywhere, underneath the sounds of gunfire and engines and artillery, there was the sound of suffering, the crying of the wounded, the wailing of frightened children, the hoarse shouts of officers trying to maintain order in a world where order had become meaningless. Among the shrinking corridors and the deepening exhaustion that had begun to settle over every surviving unit still fighting within the pocket, there emerged one geographic feature that would come to define the final hours of the encirclement itself. Hill 262, known locally as Montormel, rose modestly above the Norman countryside near the village of Chambois, and though its elevation was scarcely more than a gentle swell in the landscape by any grander measure, it occupied a position of extraordinary tactical significance as August turned toward its closing days. From its summit, one could see across miles of the surrounding terrain, the roads that twisted through the bocage, the valleys where columns of German vehicles had begun to choke together in their desperation to escape, and the narrowing funnel through which the last remnants of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS would soon have to pass if they were to avoid complete annihilation. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, veterans of earlier campaigns and survivors of their own difficult journey across Europe, had received orders to move toward this very hill to secure it before German forces could organize a coherent defense of the final gap itself. These were men who carried with them not only the weight of professional soldiering, but something deeper still, a national memory of occupation and loss, a resolve to reclaim their place in the liberation of their continent. They moved through the late summer dust with purpose, their commanders understanding with crystalline clarity that whoever controlled the high ground at Montormel would control the fate of thousands of soldiers still trapped to the east. Picture, if you will, the approach to that modest elevation, the Polish armoured units grinding forward through countryside, now devastated by weeks of almost continuous combat. The grass itself had been churned into mud in places, scorched and blackened in others, and the air carried that peculiar smell of war, diesel fuel mingled with dust, cordite, and the dank sweetness of disturbed earth. Reconnaissance patrols had already confirmed that German forces were gathering strength in the area, preparing what they likely knew would be their final attempt at a breakthrough, their last chance to slip through before the noose tightened irrevocably. The Polish commander, General Stanisław Maciek, a figure of remarkable composure and strategic acuity, understood that the division's task was not merely to occupy terrain, but to hold it against what would surely be overwhelming assault. When the Polish troops began to dig in around Mont-Ormel, securing its slopes and establishing defensive positions, they were establishing what amounted to a cork in a bottle, a human barrier between trapped German forces and whatever freedom might still exist beyond the encirclement's edge. The positions themselves were not elaborate. There was no time for the construction of elaborate fortifications. Instead, the men prepared hasty entrenchments, positioned anti-tank guns where they would command the approaches, and arranged their armor to provide mutual supporting fire across the hill's vulnerable areas. They knew with a deep and almost bone-level certainty that what was coming would be fierce. Consider the particular strain of those hours of waiting, the long afternoons settling into evening as Polish soldiers maintained their vigil on Hill 262. There is a distinctive quality to the consciousness of soldiers who know that a major assault is approaching, who have glimpsed the massing of enemy forces in the middle distance, and understand that they themselves will soon be at the center of something violent and chaotic. The sun seemed to take an unconscionable time in its descent toward the horizon. Communication lines crackled with updates about enemy movement. Ammunition was checked and rechecked. Officers moved among their men, offering steady words and ensuring that everyone understood their sector of responsibility, their field of fire, their role in the collective defense. The German forces that began to coalesce around the approach to Mont-Ormel represented a mixture of units desperately seeking escape, armored formations, mobile infantry, and notably, significant elements of the Waffen-SS, including components of the Das Reich Division and other units that had fought with particular ferocity throughout the Normandy campaign. These German commanders recognized with the same clarity as Maciek that Hill 262 now represented the critical choke point, the place where the escape route narrowed to its most vulnerable dimension. If they could break through, or even overwhelm, the Polish positions, the way would remain open for perhaps tens of thousands of soldiers and support personnel still trapped to the east. If they failed, those same forces would have no option but surrender or attempted escape through territories already controlled by Allied forces on other vectors. The attacks, when they came, arrived in waves. German armor probing the Polish defenses, attempting to find weakness, to locate the gaps in the line where penetration might be achieved. The Polish anti-tank guns, positioned with considerable skill across the hillside, proved devastatingly effective, their crews working with the kind of cold precision that could only come from extensive training and the deep muscle memory of combat. Tank against tank, the battles raged across the slopes of Mont-Ormel, the concussive force of fire creating a cacophony that echoed across the surrounding countryside, the flashes of gunfire illuminating the landscape in harsh, stroboscopic bursts of white and orange. Throughout the night of August 19th and into the early morning hours of August 20th, the intensity of the assault seemed to pulse and surge, reaching crescendos of violence before subsiding into moments of comparative quiet. The Polish soldiers, exhausted as they were, maintained their positions with remarkable tenacity. There was a quality of sacrifice that had settled over the hill, a recognition among both attackers and defenders that this place, this specific geographic feature, had become the crucible in which the fate of the entire encirclement would be decided. German forces would later describe these Polish defenders with a respect that transcended the normal boundaries of military opposition. These were men who stood firm against superior numbers and overwhelming assault, who refused to yield even as the pressure mounted relentlessly. One might imagine the perspective of a Polish soldier crouched behind his prepared position as dawn approached, watching the landscape gradually resolve from darkness into the grey-blue tones of early morning. The fighting around him had reached a kind of crescendo and then subsided, the German attacks becoming less organized, less coordinated, the German commanders seemingly accepting that the breakthrough they had hoped to achieve would not materialize through sheer force of will and tactical pressure. The hill remained in Polish hands. The cork had remained in the bottle. What becomes evident, in the quieter moments of reflection that come with the end of active combat, is the degree to which Hill 262, Mont Ormel, had served a function that extended far beyond its modest topography. By holding this position, by refusing to yield despite the intensity of German assault, the Polish 1st Armoured Division had effectively transformed a geographic location into a strategic keystone. The German escape route, already compressed and constrained by the movements of other Allied units, converging from north, south and west, had been narrowed still further by the Polish presence on this crucial hill. Those German forces still attempting to move eastward now found themselves confined to increasingly narrow roads, increasingly vulnerable to artillery fire that could be directed from the high ground, increasingly exposed to the grinding pressure of encirclement. The role that the Polish division played in those final hours of the Falaise pocket remains one of the less widely celebrated aspects of the broader encirclement, perhaps because Poland's own military contributions to the broader campaign have often been somewhat overshadowed in the historical narrative by the more extensively documented operations of larger American, British, and Canadian forces. And yet, the stand at Mont Ormel represents a moment of considerable consequence, a pivot point around which subsequent events would turn. Without the Polish presence on that hill, the escape corridor might have remained slightly more open, slightly more passable, and the full catastrophic encirclement might have been marginally less complete. The Polish soldiers who held Mont Ormel that night would later describe the experience with a particular intensity of memory, a vividness of recollection that suggested the depth of what they had experienced and endured. They spoke of the noise, the almost overwhelming barrage of noise that continuous combat creates, the roar of engines, the crack of anti-tank guns, the sharper snap of machine gun fire, the occasional boom of larger artillery pieces being brought to bear. They spoke of the exhaustion that had settled into their very bones, the strain of maintaining alertness and readiness when every fibre of their being screamed for rest. They spoke, too, of the sense of purpose, the knowledge that what they were doing mattered, that their stand on this hill was preventing something catastrophic from occurring to the forces still trapped elsewhere within the pocket. In the aftermath of those intense hours, as the German assault gradually diminished and the reality of the failed breakthrough began to settle upon German commanders, the situation within the Falaise pocket shifted into its final, concluding phase. The corridor had contracted further, the options available to German forces had been reduced still more dramatically, and the path toward either surrender or capture had become nearly inevitable for the vast majority of those still encircled. The Polish presence on Hill 262 had helped to ensure that this end would be reached, that the encirclement would be brought to its logical, if tragic, conclusion. As the pocket tightened and the hours of daylight dwindled, the German commanders came to understand that their only hope of saving significant forces lay not in holding ground, but in breaking through. The Waffen-SS divisions still possessed armour, Panther tanks, Tigers, and the lighter panzers that had carried them through years of continental warfare, and in that steel and firepower lay a bitter, last-resort gamble. These men had fought to the very edge of collapse, week upon week of attritional struggle in the Norman bocage, where every hedgerow had become a burial mound, and every village a grinding crucible of tank and anti-tank duels. Now, with the walls of the pocket visibly closing, the remaining armoured units were tasked with one final mission: punch through the narrowing corridors, create a gap, and allow the thousands of infantry, artillery, and support troops behind them to pour through to safety. The attempts began in the gathering dusk, when the light was poor enough to offer some shelter from the Allied fighters that had made daylight movement nearly suicidal. Imagine, if you will, the sound of diesel engines rumbling to life in the darkness, the metallic clink of gun traverses as turrets swung into position, the muffled shouting of officers coordinating what they knew to be a desperate venture. The Waffen-SS crews, many of them drawn from the Reich itself, others from occupied territories, young men and old soldiers alike, had been stripped of any remaining illusions about the war's outcome. What drove them forward, historians have long debated, was not conviction in final victory, but rather the terrible momentum of military discipline, loyalty to their immediate comrades, and perhaps, too, the fear of what might come if they refused. A captured order, preserved in archives, spoke of breakthrough operations with an almost dreamlike persistence, as though by naming the maneuver, by treating it as inevitable, it might somehow become so. The terrain around Trun and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, where many of these breakthrough attempts occurred, was peculiarly suited to the defense. The Norman landscape, with its shallow valleys, river crossings, and scattered farmsteads, offered Polish and Canadian forces multiple points at which to concentrate anti-tank fire. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, positioned on the heights and in the villages, had prepared gun lines with the grim determination of men who understood they were fighting for their nation's future as much as for immediate survival. When Panther tanks rolled forward, hatches sealed, the Polish gunners waited until the beasts were close enough to be certain of penetration. The 17-pounder anti-tank guns, those magnificent weapons that had become the standard of British and Commonwealth forces, could crack a Panther's armor with a well-placed shot, and the Polish crews knew intimately where to aim. What emerged from these engagements was a curious paradox of modern warfare. Individual tanks, despite their armor and firepower, were vulnerable in concentrated positions. A single Tiger, that monster that had terrorized countless soldiers, could be immobilized by a lucky hit or by coordinated anti-tank rifle fire from multiple angles. The Waffen-SS crews, understanding this intimately from months of combat, began their breakthrough attempts with a kind of methodical desperation. They would advance in staggered formations, trying to overwhelm individual gun positions with concentrated fire before those positions could be reinforced. Sometimes they succeeded in driving through a weak point, leaving burning wreckage on both sides of the line. More often, they encountered well-prepared defenses and found themselves pinned, burning, or forced to reverse back into the pocket. The destruction of vehicles and equipment during these days was on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. Photographs taken in the days after the pocket closed show roads that are more vehicle graveyard than transportation corridors. Burned-out tanks, their hulls split open by internal explosions, sat at odd angles among ditches and fields. Supply trucks had been abandoned or destroyed, their contents, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, now useless or dangerous. Artillery pieces had been spiked and left behind, made deliberately unusable by their own crews. The sheer tonnage of material lost in those final desperate days was staggering, and it speaks to a crisis that went far beyond simple military defeat. This was the physical manifestation of an army coming apart at the seams. Yet within the aggregate tragedy, individual tanks crews performed acts of considerable courage, or what might be called courage, though the word seems inadequate when applied to men who are mostly trapped. Some crews attempted to recover disabled vehicles, risking their own lives to rescue comrades. Others fought their tanks until the last round was fired, choosing to surrender or fight to the death rather than abandon their posts. There are accounts, scattered through post-war interviews, of Panther commanders who maneuvered their heavy tanks with almost balletic precision, trying to gain advantage over the anti-tank gun lines, trading shells with Polish gunners in duels that lasted minutes but felt, to those involved, like hours. One wonders what those men were thinking as they traversed their turrets, whether they maintained any hope, or whether combat had reduced them to pure, unreflective action. The role of German officers in coordinating these breakthrough attempts was hampered by the fog that had descended not just over the Norman landscape, but over the entire communication network. Radio traffic, often intercepted by the Allies, had become increasingly frantic and incoherent. Higher command, far from the pocket in Paris and beyond, issued orders that were sometimes already obsolete by the time they reached the units below. The immediate commanders, panzer officers with names now largely forgotten, had to make decisions in real time. With fragmentary intelligence and shrinking resources, did a particular escape route through the Orne Valley remain open? Was the Polish position on Hill 262 actually as strong as it appeared? Could one more coordinated assault break through? These questions, asked and re-asked in the darkness, reflected the cascading uncertainty of a military organization that was hemorrhaging not just men and machines, but its capacity to function. The destruction of equipment accelerated as the pocket contracted further. Vehicles that could not be moved due to fuel shortages were systematically destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. Anti-tank guns were dismantled and left behind. Radio equipment was smashed. Officers made the bitter calculation that it was preferable for a gun to be destroyed by friendly hands than to remain as a trophy of defeat. Yet even as they worked to deny the enemy material, they could not deny the enemy the men who had served that material. Thousands of soldiers began the psychological adjustment to capture, a shift that military historians have sometimes characterized as a kind of relief, and sometimes as a kind of death in itself. By the night of August 19th and into the 20th, the breakdown of organized armored operations was nearly complete. What remained were fragments, individual tank crews and small groups attempting their own private breakouts, some successful in slipping through despite the darkness, others caught in the tightening net. The grand strategy of coordinated armor assaults had given way to a far more chaotic reality of isolated engagements and personal survival decisions. The destruction visible on the roads and fields around Falaise would become one of the war's most iconic images of industrial warfare's consequences, a landscape where steel and fire had been applied to the full extent of their terrible potential. And yet, as the German columns churned through those August nights and the tank engines groaned along the Norman roads, there existed another crisis entirely, one that rarely appears in the tactical maps or the commander's after-action reports. The farms and villages that ringed the pocket, the stone cottages with their shuttered windows, and the apple orchards that had stood for generations, these had become, in a matter of weeks, a landscape of catastrophe for those who called it home. The people of Normandy had endured more than 4 years of German occupation. They had grown accustomed, in the way humans do, to the presence of soldiers, the requisitions of grain and livestock, the forced labor details. There was a rhythm to oppression, a kind of terrible normalcy. But when the Allies broke out from their beachheads in early August, when the Wehrmacht began its desperate retreat eastward, that rhythm shattered entirely, and the civilian population found themselves caught, quite literally, between two advancing armies. Imagine, if you will, a farmhouse near Chambois. A family, perhaps an elderly couple, their son away in the war, a daughter-in-law with 2 young children, had weathered the occupation by keeping their heads down, tending their fields, saying nothing. The apple harvest was weeks away. There were cows to milk, a vegetable garden to maintain. Life, however constrained, continued. But then, in those frantic days of August, the sound of artillery began to boom closer, day by day, night by night. The windows rattled, plaster fell from the ceilings. At first, there were orders from German officers to evacuate eastward, to move inland, away from the fighting. Then came confusion, contradictory orders, rumors of armored columns heading through the area. Some families fled, others, old or exhausted, or simply unable to believe their home was truly in danger, remained. The roads became rivers of refugees. Carts pulled by oxen, bicycles laden with what people could carry, mothers pushing wheelbarrows containing a few pieces of furniture, photographs, the accumulated weight of a lifetime. The dust rose in clouds, and mixed with that dust were the fumes from military vehicles, German trucks filled with soldiers, supply convoys attempting to escape the pocket, all of it moving in a haze of urgency and fear. French civilians and German soldiers, shared the same roads, often in opposite directions or at cross purposes, creating a chaos that was neither war nor peace, but something far more unsettling. One account, recorded by a historian many years later, describes a woman named Marguerite, who lived in a hamlet just outside Falaise. She had decided to stay, believing that surely the fighting would not come so close to her modest cottage. Her neighbour had a radio, and they listened to the BBC broadcasts, trying to understand what was happening. By August 16th, artillery fire was so close that it shook the ground itself. The cottage across the lane took a direct hit, not from an explosion but from shrapnel. Still, Marguerite remained, barricading her door and sheltering with her cat in the cellar, where the sound of the bombardment came down as a distant, rolling thunder, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles and the irregular chatter of machine gun fire from the fields all around. What was it like, I wonder, to hear the sounds of battle drawing closer, to know that soldiers were dying or being captured just beyond your garden wall? The uncertainty must have been almost worse than the danger itself. Would the Germans hold the line here? Would the Allies break through? Which soldiers, yours or theirs, would arrive first? And what would they do when they arrived? The destruction of property, when it came, was often incidental to the larger military objectives, yet no less devastating to those who witnessed it. An orchard that had produced apples for 2 centuries could be torn to pieces by tank tracks and artillery fire in an afternoon. Stone farmhouses, some of them medieval, were reduced to rubble because they offered a defensible position or because they lay in a line of fire. There was no time for preservation, for sorrow, for the rituals of loss. The war simply moved through the landscape, transforming it into something unrecognizable. One particularly poignant detail comes from the testimony of a schoolteacher from Trun, a village that sat almost at the heart of the pocket's geography. She recalls a group of German soldiers passing through on foot in the early hours of August 17th, looking, she said, like men who no longer believed they would survive the day. They were hungry and thirsty, and she gave them water from the well. Some hours later, Canadian soldiers arrived, and she gave them water as well. The teacher was struck, in the years afterward, by how little separated these men in her memory, both exhausted, both far from home, both caught in a machinery that neither of them had truly chosen to enter. The war, for her, became not an abstract conflict between nations, but a terrible intimacy with human suffering on all sides. The psychological toll on Norman civilians was compounded by the simple fact of displacement. Thousands of people were forced to leave their homes with almost no warning, carrying what they could manage, walking or traveling in whatever vehicles were available. Many ended up in improvised camps or in larger towns that were themselves under bombardment. There were stories of families separated in the chaos, of children lost in the dust and confusion, of reunions that only came weeks or months later, or never came at all. An old woman from Chambois, interviewed decades after the war, still seemed unable to comprehend why her grandson had been with her one moment and simply gone the next, swept away in the press of refugees and soldiers. The Norman landscape itself bore witness to this human tragedy. Farmyards became temporary cemeteries. Ditches along country roads were sometimes used to bury the dead, hastily and without ceremony. Civilians and soldiers alike were laid to rest wherever the fighting had ended, whatever side they had been on. The grass grew over these graves, and seasons turned, but the earth held the memory of those August days. There is a particular kind of loss that comes not from grand historical events, but from the simple displacement of ordinary life. The baker in Falaise, who never returned to open his shop. The farmer near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, who watched from a refugee centre as other people's cows grazed in his unfenced fields. The schoolchildren who missed an entire academic year, their education interrupted by evacuation and the uncertainty of where, if anywhere, they would finally settle. These losses were seldom recorded in official dispatches, yet they may have been, for the people who experienced them, quite as devastating as the military losses themselves. What becomes clear when one allows the mind to linger on these quieter aspects of the Falaise pocket is that the encirclement and the military crisis affecting the Waffen-SS divisions represented only one layer of a much more complex human catastrophe. The soldiers caught in the pocket were desperate to escape, certainly, and many would die or be captured before that escape became possible. But the civilians who lived in that landscape, who had built lives and communities there across generations, were experiencing a different and perhaps in some ways deeper crisis. A crisis of displacement, of loss of home, of the rupture of the ordinary rhythms by which human communities sustain themselves. One thinks of the silence that must have descended on those Normandy villages in the weeks after the fighting moved away. The roads were littered with abandoned vehicles, spent ammunition casings, the debris of a destroyed military force. But the homes were empty. The fields, untended and overgrown with soldiers' equipment, lay fallow. The apple orchards remained unharvested. It would take years, in some cases decades, for the psychological landscape to recover, for the land itself to feel like home again, rather than like a place where something violent and foreign had occurred. And the people who returned, when they finally did return, came back to find that the world had fundamentally changed. Not just the physical landscape, though that too had changed, but the social fabric, the trust, the ability to imagine the future without the fear of war. These things are harder to rebuild than a farmhouse, harder to restore than a field of grain. They require a different kind of healing, one that unfolds at a different pace, in the quiet conversations and the long, slow work of learning to live again in a place where so much had been lost. The roads around Falaise began to take on a quality of desolation as the pocket tightened in those final August days, a kind of visual testimony to exhaustion and surrender that would remain etched into the landscape for decades. What had been organized columns of soldiers and vehicles devolved into something far less orderly, a churning mass of men, horses and machinery, compressed into an ever-narrowing corridor, all of it slowly bleeding away under the weight of encirclement. By August 19th and 20th, the mathematics of escape had shifted irrevocably. Where once there had seemed to be possibilities, there now remained only the grinding arithmetic of how many could slip through before the gap closed entirely. The moment of structural collapse in the pocket came not all at once, but in waves, a cascade of surrenders that began on the periphery and rippled inward. Allied soldiers advancing through villages like Chambois and Trun encountered an almost surreal mingling of resistance and capitulation, scattered pockets of German troops, some fighting with the desperation of men, with nothing left to lose, others laying down weapons with a resignation that spoke of weeks spent in shrinking forests and diminishing hope. The Waffen-SS units, by reputation the most fanatical and least inclined toward surrender, nonetheless found themselves caught between the immovable facts of their situation. Ammunition was genuinely depleted. Fuel had long since run out, leaving vehicles abandoned by the score. And the ring of Allied forces closing in from north, south, east and west allowed for no illusion that retreat was possible or that holding out served any purpose beyond dying in place. In those final days, the roads themselves became a kind of archaeological record of collapse. Consider what an Allied soldier or Polish tanker would encounter when moving through the pocket in late August. The sheer concentration of abandoned equipment scattered across the Norman countryside. Tank hulls still smoking from the previous day's fighting, their turrets blown askew. Trucks lined up wheel to wheel, some burned to blackened husks, others simply stopped where their drivers had run out of fuel and climbed down to surrender or slip away on foot. Artillery pieces positioned but never fired because there was no one left to crew them properly. Supply dumps hastily abandoned, their contents sometimes salvaged by roving groups of soldiers, sometimes simply left to the grass and insects. Horse-drawn wagons, still very much a part of the German army's logistics in 1944, lay overturned or picked clean of their cargo. The scale of material loss was genuinely staggering, not just in absolute numbers, though those were enormous, but in its psychological impact. What did it mean for a soldier to see his entire battalion's worth of equipment scattered across a few square kilometers of French farmland? The human landscape was equally fragmented. Prisoners were being collected in groups that grew larger almost by the hour, hundreds, then thousands, then by some estimates upward of 50,000. The process of surrender was often mundane despite the epic scale of what was unfolding. A unit commander would assess that further resistance was futile, perhaps after consultation with his remaining officers. Weapons would be stacked or thrown aside. White flags, sometimes improvised from cloth, sometimes simply torn pages held aloft, would appear, and then the strange choreography of becoming a prisoner of war would begin. The processing, the searches, the long marches to the rear guard areas, where camps were being hastily established. These weren't always orderly affairs. Some German soldiers were treated with the formality of military convention. Others encountered the rage of soldiers who had seen their comrades die day after day in the preceding weeks, and there are documented instances in which the transition from combatant to captive came with brutality that history acknowledges uneasily, if at all. Yet there were also moments of a peculiar humanity amid the collapse. An American or Canadian soldier offering a cigarette to a German who had just become a prisoner, a wounded man being helped to the rear, rank mattering less than the simple fact of human need. Polish and German soldiers, who had fought with particular bitterness in this sector, nonetheless sometimes treating each other with the grim professionalism of men who understood they were both caught in circumstances largely beyond their control. What did these brief flickers of something other than killing mean in the context of war? Perhaps they meant that even in the depths of mechanized slaughter, the human capacity for recognition of shared suffering remained stubborn and real, woven into individual choices that no general's order could fully suppress. The destruction visible in the pocket was, by almost any measure, appalling. Not quite the scale of what would be found at sites of the most intense fighting elsewhere, the grinding meat grinder of the Eastern Front, but in its own way, it was a stunning manifestation of what modern industrial warfare could do to concentrated military forces. Estimates vary depending on the source and what is being counted, but somewhere in the range of 9,000 to 10,000 German soldiers were killed in the closing days of the pocket. Another 50,000 or more became prisoners. The material losses included not just tanks and artillery, but entire supply trains, administrative centers, medical facilities, and the 1,000 small pieces of infrastructure that sustained a military force in the field. There were German division commanders who found themselves cut off from their units, senior officers who were captured in their command vehicles, and lower-ranking soldiers who simply ceased to exist in any official capacity, their fates never properly recorded. One of the remarkable aspects of the collapse, difficult to capture fully in a narrative account, but perhaps worth sitting with quietly, is how the momentum of the encirclement itself became a kind of force that no individual decision could effectively resist. A soldier might resolve to escape, to slip away into the Norman bocage, and make his way back east toward German-held territory. But the density of Allied forces, the constant presence of aircraft overhead during daylight hours, the deliberate harassment and interdiction of any organized movement, and simply the sheer physical exhaustion that weeks of combat and minimal rations produces, these combined into something close to an insurmountable obstacle. In military history, we sometimes speak of the inevitable, and there is a risk in that language of removing human agency from events. But in the case of Falaise in those final days, there was something approaching the genuinely inevitable about the way the pocket could not continue to exist. The roads themselves, which had been so crucial to German military movement and supply, became monuments to that impossibility. Along the narrow corridors that remained open, the sheer weight of traffic, not organized convoys but rather chaotic streams of desperate men and vehicles competing for the same limited space, created bottlenecks that were devastating. A tank might break down or run out of fuel, blocking the road. A shell might land, scattering columns and creating confusion. These were the moments when the orderly process of retreat transformed into something far more fragmented and desperate. The commander of the Polish 1st Armored Division, observing from Hill 262, could see down into the pocket and witness what was essentially the death throes of an enormous military force. One can imagine the strange sensation of watching an enemy disintegrate from a distance, the clarity of knowing that you are witnessing something historically significant, even as the fighting continues, and men around you are still being killed. The material culture of collapse was everywhere for those with eyes to see it. Personal effects scattered across farmland, letters from home abandoned in destroyed vehicles, photographs of wives and children churned into the mud by tank treads. There is something peculiarly haunting about these remnants, the intimate objects that soldiers carry with them, suddenly separated from their owners and exposed to the indifference of weather and time. Some of these items were collected by Norman civilians, who would inherit a kind of archaeological relationship to the battle through the things they found in their fields. Others were simply left to decompose or be ploughed under by farmers attempting to reclaim their land in the weeks and months after the fighting ended. In the days immediately following the closing of the pocket, what military historians refer to with almost antiseptic precision as the reduction of the encirclement, the landscape presented a tableau that was genuinely difficult to process, even for soldiers hardened by months of fighting. How many times in military history does an entire enemy force collapse so completely that the victor is almost overwhelmed by the sheer logistical challenge of managing the prisoners, the equipment, the dead? The roads around Falaise bore the marks of that unprecedented collapse. Tire tracks in impossible directions where drivers had attempted to escape across fields, shell craters in no particular pattern, and the twisted remains of vehicles that spoke to the violence with which the encirclement had finally closed. In the hours after collapse, when the formal order of the pocket had dissolved into individual survival, the roads and fields around Falaise became places of extraordinary quietness, punctuated by sudden violence. The larger formations, the coherent divisions with their staff cars and radio nets, had largely disintegrated or been captured. What remained were scattered clusters of soldiers, sometimes a handful, sometimes a few dozen, moving through the Norman landscape with the singular purpose of evading the net that was still drawing tight around them. One such group, members of the Das Reich Division, found themselves on foot near the village of Saint-Lambert in the early hours before dawn. The roads, which had once carried the thunder of panzer columns, were now choked with the remnants of retreat. Abandoned vehicles still smouldering, wrecked horse-drawn carts, equipment scattered like the detritus of a great tide going out. They moved away from these highways deliberately, guided by compass and by the fading memory of maps glimpsed before things began to fall apart. The forests of Lower Normandy, with their dense thickets and streams running toward the Dives River, offered a sanctuary of sorts. The canopy here was thick enough to provide cover from the fighter bombers that still hunted overhead, though by this stage of the collapse, the Allies were moving so quickly that the coordination of airstrikes had become as confused as everything else on the ground. What these soldiers understood, with the clarity that survival sometimes grants, was that the gaps in the encirclement were closing second by second. The Polish forces holding Montormel were only kilometers away. Canadian and American patrols were moving through the surrounding villages with increasing frequency. The logic of escape was therefore simple and ancient. Move at night, hide during the day, follow water, avoid roads. The Dives River and its smaller tributaries became routes and reference points for groups attempting to head northward and westward, toward regions where the German lines still held, or where the chaos of the retreat might provide cover. The terrain itself became a character in these journeys. The landscape northwest of Falaise is neither flat nor mountainous, but rolling and intimate, cut through with small valleys and sunken lanes. Many of these roads had been worn down by centuries of use until they ran well below the surrounding fields. Paths that had provided defensive advantages to Norman forces in centuries past now became natural corridors for men trying to slip away. A soldier walking through these lanes, even in daylight, might not be visible to someone 20 meters away on the higher ground. Groups moved through them hunched and alert, the weight of their equipment a constant reminder of the distance they still had to cover. What strikes one, reading the fragmentary accounts that survive, is the extent to which these escapes depended on chance encounters and individual decisions. There was no grand coordinated breakout, no coherent plan. Instead, men made choices moment by moment. A Wehrmacht lieutenant named Steiner, or so one account records, though such names may be pseudonyms in documents from this era, found himself with perhaps 15 soldiers, most of them younger men conscripted in the last year of the war. They had been separated from their unit in the chaos of the pocket's collapse. Rather than attempt to fight toward some distant line, they decided, without discussion, to head toward the forest near the hamlet of Touffreville. The logic was that forests meant concealment, and concealment meant time, and time meant options. The nights were long enough that summer in Normandy, but not long enough to cover the distances these men needed to traverse. They walked perhaps 10 kilometers in the darkness, before sheltering in a small copse as dawn approached. One soldier's diary, captured later by the Allies, recorded the mundane details of this moment. The dampness in the air, the sound of an aircraft engine somewhere in the distance, the way his feet ached inside boots that had been walked in for 3 days straight. Men who have survived wars often speak of such moments, not the spectacular violence, but the grinding fatigue, the hunger, the cold that comes even in August when you are wet and afraid. Groups of escapees learn to sense proximity to Allied positions through subtler signs. Displaced civilians moving along minor roads might indicate that an area was recently cleared. The presence of abandoned bicycles and hastily packed bundles suggested civilian flight rather than military occupation. Once, a group of Waffen-SS men encountered a French farmer in a field. The farmer, whether through fear or compassion or simple pragmatism, did not immediately alert the authorities. He told them that Canadian patrols were moving through the adjacent valleys, but that the forest to the west remained untouched. Was this information reliable? The soldiers would never know. They moved west. The rivers themselves presented both opportunity and danger. The Dives, when one finally reached it, flowed northeastward toward the Seine. Crossing water was always a moment of vulnerability. Soldiers in the water could not move quickly, could not take defensive positions. Yet remaining in the area meant walking in circles or moving toward known Allied positions. Some groups, perhaps 10 or 12 in total, chose to attempt water crossings at night. They waded through channels that came up to their chests, holding their weapons above their heads, hoping that no patrol had positioned itself on the far bank. How many succeeded? How many became isolated on the far side, unable to link up with their companions, forced to press on individually into the unknown? The records are largely silent on this. What is perhaps most striking, examining the testimonies that surfaced in the post-war years, is the extreme psychological vulnerability of these moments. These were soldiers who had known, for weeks, the experience of being hunted from above, of watching their formations decimated by artillery and air power. They had endured the claustrophobic terror of being surrounded. Now, in small groups, or sometimes alone, they moved through hostile territory, knowing that capture was likely, that survival was a matter of chance and navigation and luck. Yet curiously, many accounts speak not of despair, but of a kind of clinical focus. The complexity of warfare at the divisional level had dissolved. Survival had become purely a matter of personal choice and physical action. Perhaps there is a perverse liberation in such simplicity. One group of perhaps 7 or 8 men, details obscured by the vagueness of surviving accounts and the passage of 80 years, made their way through the forest east of Trun. They were guided, it is said, by a German officer who had studied the terrain before the offensive in Normandy. They moved deliberately, not rushing, understanding that haste led to mistakes, and that mistakes led to death. They avoided all paths and fields where they could see evidence of human activity. They drank from streams and ate what little food they carried. After 2 nights and a day of this movement, they emerged into a region where the front lines had already moved on. The Wehrmacht still held some territory, scattered and fragmented though it was, to the north and east. Whether they reached it, whether they managed to integrate into some surviving formation, The records do not clearly state. Probability suggests that some did, that some were captured by advancing forces, that some may have found shelter with sympathetic French civilians, and eventually emerged after the war. The experience of these individual escapes, and there must have been hundreds of such journeys, each one singular, each one shaped by the decisions of the men involved and the terrain they crossed, constitutes a kind of understory to the grand narrative of the Falaise pocket's closure. The official history records the battles, the commanders' decisions, the casualty figures. It is precise about divisions and regiments, but it is necessarily vague about the fate of individuals. Some estimates suggest that as many as 20% of the German forces in the pocket managed to escape rather than be killed or captured. Others claim the figure was lower, perhaps 10%. The truth likely lies somewhere between these numbers, distributed across thousands of small moments in forests and fields, each one unrecorded and unremarkable except to the men who lived through it. In the weeks and months that followed the collapse of the Falaise pocket, historians and military analysts began the difficult work of sifting through wreckage, literal and documentary, to understand what had truly happened in those August fields. The counting began, not in a single moment, but across 1,000 scattered conversations between survivors, in captured German records, in after-action reports filed by exhausted Allied commanders. Numbers, it turned out, were far more elusive than the physical evidence of destruction that lay across the Norman landscape. The initial assessments were stark. When the pocket fully closed in mid-August, estimates suggested that somewhere between 50 and 100,000 German troops had been caught within the encirclement. Many sources placed the figure closer to 70,000. Canadian, Polish, American, and British units had converged on roads choked with retreating soldiers, abandoned vehicles, artillery pieces, and the wreckage of what had once been cohesive military formations. The fields around Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives became a kind of open-air museum of destruction. Tank chassis twisted into unrecognizable shapes, trucks immobilized where they stalled, supply wagons overturned in panicked flight. To count the dead was simple enough in theory. To count the captured, or more vexingly, the escaped, proved far more complicated. Historians have long noted that German casualty records from the closing stages of the Normandy campaign were chaotic at best and utterly lost at worst. When an army is in dissolution, when radio networks collapse and command hierarchies fragment, the meticulous bookkeeping of military bureaucracy tends to evaporate. Some units simply cease to exist as organized entities, their surviving members scattering into small groups that made their way eastward through whatever gaps remained in the Allied cordon. How does one count soldiers who slipped away in darkness, who abandoned their uniforms, who walked for days through forests and along riverbanks? The answer, quite honestly, is that you cannot count them with precision. You can only estimate, often quite widely. The figure that emerged from immediate Allied debriefings and later historical analysis suggested that somewhere between 40 and 50,000 German troops were captured or killed within the pocket itself. Some assessments, more conservative, placed captured prisoners at closer to 40,000. The remainder, perhaps 20 to 30,000 soldiers, appear to have escaped the immediate encirclement, though the manner and timing of that escape remains contested among scholars. Some broke through in organized units on the nights of August 15th and 16th, when the corridor still possessed openings wide enough for desperate men to push through. Others simply dissolved into the Norman landscape, individual soldiers and small groups moving eastward on foot, avoiding main roads, seeking the comparative safety of distance. What makes this historical debate so fascinating and so deeply uncertain is that different military archives record different figures. German unit histories, insofar as they survived the war, tend to report higher escape figures than Allied records suggest. American intelligence summaries from the period contain wildly varying estimates, depending on which divisions submitted the report and how thoroughly they surveyed their own sector of the closing pocket. Canadian historical records emphasize the scale of prisoner intake in their zone, while Polish accounts focus on the intensity of combat rather than precise headcount. Each perspective reveals something true, and yet no single perspective reveals the whole truth. Falaise was not, in this sense, a clean mathematical problem to be solved. It was a catastrophe still unfolding in real time, with thousands of individuals making their own decisions about surrender, flight, and survival. Some Waffen-SS soldiers, particularly those from the elite formations that had survived weeks of attritional combat, possessed the training and determination to escape, even from apparently closed pockets. Other men, exhausted, demoralized, or simply unable to navigate the chaos of the collapsing front, surrendered at the first opportunity. The variability of human choice under extreme stress makes precise accounting nearly impossible. Consider the experience of the Das Reich Division, one of the Waffen-SS formations most thoroughly trapped in the pocket. German records suggest the division lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 men killed or missing, with perhaps 2,000 captured. Yet contemporary Allied assessments often counted higher prisoner figures from this unit. Which number is correct? Perhaps both, depending on how you define captured in the fevered hours when soldiers were changing hands, when some men surrendered to one unit only to be herded toward collecting points held by another, when records were kept on scraps of paper and then lost in the chaos of rapid advance. The debate over Falaise's true outcome has never fully settled, and that persistent historical uncertainty carries its own weight. Some scholars have argued that the Allies' failure to complete an absolute encirclement, to close the pocket entirely before substantial German forces escaped, represented a significant missed opportunity. Had every German soldier in Normandy been captured or killed, the subsequent pursuit toward the Rhine might have proceeded more swiftly. Others counter that the pocket, even if incompletely closed, inflicted such severe damage on German formations that their ability to conduct coherent defense in the weeks that followed was permanently compromised. In this view, precision mattered less than the net effect, the destruction of an army's cohesion, the accumulation of losses across divisions, the loss of experienced officers and sergeants who could never truly be replaced. What is beyond dispute is the material cost. The Falaise pocket left behind an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, hundreds of tanks and assault guns rendered into scrap metal, tons of artillery pieces either destroyed or captured. The roads were lined with the detritus of an army in disintegration. When photographs were taken in the days after the final collapse, they show landscapes almost incomprehensible in their density of destruction, not the isolated wreckage of individual battles, but rather a continuous ribbon of devastation stretching across miles of Norman countryside. No amount of historical debate could erase that physical evidence. Yet the human numbers remain stubbornly opaque. How many Waffen-SS soldiers walked out of Falaise? The answer offered by historians, after decades of careful study, is somewhere between 20 and 30,000. Some sources, working from German unit records, suggest the number might have been slightly higher. Others, emphasizing the comprehensive nature of the encirclement and the effectiveness of Allied blocking positions, place it lower. The honest historian must acknowledge that we will likely never know the exact figure, and that this uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship, but rather an honest reflection of the incomplete and contradictory nature of the evidence itself. What we can say with greater confidence is how these figures changed the narrative of the Normandy campaign's final phase. The escape of significant German forces meant that coherent military units were able to reform east of the Seine, that a continuous German defense line, however tenuous, could be maintained for several more weeks. The Wehrmacht's subsequent collapse, when it came, happened not in the Falaise pocket, but across a wider frontier in early September. In this sense, the soldiers who slipped away from the closing encirclement left behind not just the wreckage of their units, but also questions about how differently the liberation of France might have unfolded had they been captured or destroyed wholesale. Historians continue to examine captured German documents, unit records on both sides, and the accounts of surviving soldiers, many of whom are now elderly or have passed away. Each new archive that opens, each memoir that surfaces, provides another small piece of the puzzle. Yet the overall picture remains what it always was: incomplete, contradictory, and profoundly human in its lack of precision. What had begun as a tactical encirclement in the third week of August had become, by the final days of that month, something far larger than any single general had imagined. A transformation that would reshape not merely the campaign in Normandy, but the entire trajectory of the war in Western Europe. The Falaise pocket, in its closing, represented a threshold. Behind it lay the exhausting, grinding attritional warfare of the hedgerow country, the bocage, with its ancient stone walls and sunken lanes, where progress was measured in dozens of meters and paid for in blood. Ahead lay something almost unimaginable to soldiers who had fought there: open ground, rapid maneuver, the possibility of pursuit and exploitation on a continental scale. The significance of Falaise, in its deepest measure, was not merely military, but psychological and logistical. When the pocket finally closed, when the Waffen-SS divisions that had fought so desperately through July and early August ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces, the German army in France lost its capacity for organized resistance in the north. This was not the end of the war, of course. Vast territories remained in German hands, defensive lines still existed deeper within France, and the Wehrmacht still possessed formidable reserves and the will to fight. But something irreplaceable had been broken. The formations that escaped Falaise, and they did escape in significant numbers despite the legends of total annihilation, were fragments rather than divisions. They were units with depleted ranks, shattered morale in many cases, and equipment that could not easily be replaced. Consider what this meant for the pursuit that followed. Historians and military analysts have long debated the precise casualty figures from the pocket, whether 30,000 Germans died there, or whether the true number was closer to 10 or 15,000, with the remainder successful in slipping through to fight again further east. The ambiguity itself matters, because it reflects the chaos of the moment. But even if we accept the more conservative estimates, the material loss was almost incomprehensible. Thousands upon thousands of vehicles lay abandoned or destroyed across the Norman landscape. Artillery pieces, tanks, ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, the entire logistical apparatus of an army group, gutted. A German soldier attempting to continue the fight east of the pocket would have done so with perhaps half the equipment he possessed a week earlier. This cascading consequence shaped the liberation of Paris more directly than many accounts acknowledge. The capital, for decades the symbolic heart of French nationhood, had been promised to the Allies by de Gaulle as the crowning achievement of the Normandy campaign. Paris liberated would mean France restored. Yet the path to Paris lay through a hostile countryside where German forces, though fractured, still attempted to hold defensive positions. If the German army in Normandy had retained the cohesion it possessed in mid-August, if the divisions destroyed at Falaise had instead remained as fighting formations capable of coordinated resistance, the liberation of Paris might well have been delayed by weeks. Eisenhower's timetable might have slipped, political objectives would have shifted. History, in its subtle alterations, hangs upon such fulcrums. What Falaise accomplished, then, was to remove the German army's capacity to conduct a strategic defense of northern France. The Wehrmacht did not collapse entirely. That would come later, in the autumn and winter, as Germany's overall position deteriorated and the armies of the Soviet Union approached from the east. But after Falaise, the German forces in France could only attempt to delay, to inflict cost on the Allies, without any genuine hope of reversing the campaign or achieving a negotiated peace. The Waffen-SS divisions that had been committed to the pocket, those formations that had fought with a fanaticism born of ideology and pride, were suddenly rendered irrelevant to the strategic equation. They had been expended, replaced by older men, by garrison troops, by formations pulled hastily from occupation duties. The German line continued to hold, but it held more tenuously with each passing day. The broader campaign in Normandy, viewed from this perspective, resolved itself into a classical pattern of military victory. The initial breakout from the beachheads, the costly fighting through the bocage, the encirclement and destruction of German forces attempting to contain the breakout. These were not separate engagements but chapters of a single narrative arc. Falaise was the conclusion of that arc, the moment where American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces achieved the concentration of combat power necessary to decisively defeat organized German resistance in the north. From that conclusion flowed all that came after: the rapid pursuit eastward, the encirclement of German forces in other regions, the isolation of French fortified towns still stubbornly held by German garrisons, and finally, the swift movement toward Paris itself. The geography of the campaign undergoes a curious transformation when understood through the lens of what Falaise enabled. The Norman landscape, with its hedgerows and rivers and ancient villages, had been an ideal defensive terrain for Germany, a landscape that favored the defender, that demanded of the attacker meticulous planning and acceptance of high casualties. Yet the very defeat of German forces in that landscape, and specifically the failure of the German command to escape the Falaise pocket intact, opened a second geography entirely. To the south and east lay the Loire Valley, the plateaus of central France, the approaches to the Rhine, terrain that favored rapid movement, that allowed cavalry and armor to exercise their capabilities without the grinding attritional cost demanded by the bocage. When German commanders who survived the Falaise pocket were interviewed after the war, they spoke frequently of a sense of lost opportunity. If they had managed to break out earlier, if they had not committed so many resources to the containment of the beachhead. Yet these were the reflections of men who had already lost. The deeper truth, perhaps, is that by the time Falaise formed as a possibility in late August, German options had already contracted to almost nothing. The strategic initiative had passed to the Allies. All that remained was the tactical question of how thoroughly that strategic victory could be translated into the destruction of German fighting capacity. Falaise provided one answer: a pocket that, in retrospective analysis, represented the last major concentration of German organized resistance in France. Paris lay less than 200 kilometers to the southeast of the Falaise pocket. It was close enough that on clear days, from certain vantage points on the Norman heights, one might almost sense its presence on the horizon. For soldiers fighting in the pocket, both German and Allied, Paris remained an abstraction, a place mentioned in briefings and orders, a destination that seemed both imminent and impossibly distant. Yet the chain of causation that would place American tanks on the streets of Paris within days of the pocket's closure began with Falaise itself. Without the destruction of organized German resistance there, without the shattering of the German army's capacity to resist coherently, that advance would have been far slower, far more costly, far less certain in its achievement. What historians now recognize, and what soldiers at the time could only dimly perceive through the fog of battle, is that Falaise represented a kind of culmination. It was the moment when the outcome of the Normandy campaign transitioned from uncertain to inevitable. Before Falaise, German officers could still harbor hopes of containing the beachhead, of inflicting such casualties on the Allies that a negotiated settlement might become possible. After Falaise, such hopes belonged to fantasy. The war in Western Europe had been decided in August 1944 on the Norman landscape, in the fighting around the villages that surrounded the slowly closing pocket. Everything that followed, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine, the final collapse of German resistance, flowed inevitably from that decision, as water flows downhill after a watershed has been crossed. When you stand today on the road between Chambois and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, the fields look much as they must have looked in late August of that year, though the eye searching those gentle slopes cannot easily find the violence anymore. The grass has grown over the shell craters. The hedgerows, though broken by modern farming, still define the landscape in their ancient Norman way, and yet the ground remembers. This is perhaps one of the quietest truths about places where terrible things have occurred, that they do not shout their history, they whisper it, if you are patient enough to listen. At Mont-Ormel, the highest point in the pocket, the Polish erected a memorial in the years after the war. It stands now, a modest and dignified structure, overlooking the same terrain where the 1st Polish Armored Division held their ground against the overwhelming tide of German breakout attempts. If you were to climb to that monument on a clear autumn day, you would see for kilometers in all directions the undulating farmland, the scattered villages with their church steeples, the winding roads that saw so much traffic and terror in those 72 hours. The view is, in a strange way, peaceful. The wind moves through the grass as it always has, crows call to one another from the trees, and standing there, you might wonder how a place can hold such profound tragedy and still return, in time, to ordinary beauty. The memorial itself bears the names and insignia of the units that fought there, the Poles who paid so dearly for those positions, but also acknowledgement of the soldiers from many nations whose fate was decided on this ground. There is something in the restraint of European war memorials that speaks to a deeper understanding of loss than more grandiose monuments might convey. The names are there, the dates are there, and somehow, that is enough. Visitors come in the summer months, families walking slowly through the grass, reading plaques, pointing out the view to children who may or may not understand why this particular hill mattered so much, so long ago. The landscape around Chambois tells a different kind of story. The town itself was reconstructed after the war, as so many Norman towns were, and life has moved forward there in the ordinary way of human communities. People work, children go to school, shopkeepers open their doors each morning. And yet, if you walk the lanes that lead out of the town toward the open country, you may still find yourself on roads that were choked with retreating soldiers and desperate civilians 80 years ago. The buildings beside you are newer, but their foundations might rest on the same earth that saw the chaos of those final hours. Some of those buildings, perhaps, were rebuilt from the rubble of what stood before. There is a quieter memorial at Chambois as well, a place where the pocket effectively closed, where the last escape routes were sealed by the meeting of Polish and Canadian forces. It is easy to pass by if you are not looking for it, and perhaps that is appropriate. The most important memorials are not always the largest. Sometimes they are the ones that require you to step slightly off the main path, to pause and consider. When you do pause there, the ordinary sounds of the Norman countryside continue around you. Birds, wind, the distant sound of a tractor perhaps, and those sounds somehow make the silence of the memorial more profound. The healing of the landscape has been profound, and to many who lived through those times, perhaps surprising. In the immediate post-war years, those fields must have seemed like they might never recover, so scarred and wounded did they appear. Yet nature is patient and persistent. The shell craters filled with water and gradually with sediment, becoming small ponds and marshes that attracted water birds and supported local ecosystems. The hedgerows, those ancient boundaries of Norman agriculture, regenerated themselves despite the trauma they had endured. Roads were repaired, homes were rebuilt. The farms that had been destroyed began to produce crops again, feeding the people who remained and returned. And yet the ground has not forgotten. Farmers working these fields even now occasionally unearth reminders of what transpired there. Shell fragments, spent cartridges, sometimes more sobering discoveries that occasionally require authorities to visit and remove dangerous ordnance that remains unexploded after 8 decades. These discoveries always draw a moment of reflection, a brief acknowledgement that beneath the peaceful surface, the consequences of those few days remain literally embedded in the soil. The landscape heals, but it does not erase. It cannot. When historians and pilgrims visit the Falaise pocket today, they are struck by a particular paradox. The place where so much violence occurred, where so many men died or were wounded or captured, where such desperation and chaos unfolded, is now, in its physical form, almost gentle. The roads are quiet, the villages are small and rural. The scale of the landscape can deceive you into thinking that what happened here must have been smaller than it actually was, and yet the casualty figures do not diminish. The number of men lost does not reduce, because the ground has become beautiful again. If anything, the contrast between the peaceful present and the violent past serves to underline the fragility of peace, the closeness of chaos, the way that ordinary farmland can in the span of hours become the site of desperate struggle. At the monuments themselves, you notice certain details that speak to the meticulous attention that memorial committees have brought to this task of remembering. There are plaques explaining, in multiple languages, what happened here and when. There are the names carved into stone or bronze. There are sometimes personal touches, flowers left by visitors, wreaths placed by veterans' organizations on anniversaries. These gestures, small in themselves, become a kind of conversation across time between those who remember and those who did not experience it directly. It is a conversation conducted in the language of commemoration, in the shared human understanding that some things must not be forgotten, must be actively remembered, or else the lessons they contain might slip away into the mists of history. The Normandy American Cemetery and the various European war cemeteries in the region serve as anchors for this ongoing remembering. The carefully maintained grounds, the precise rows of white crosses or headstones, the meticulous records of who lies where, all of this represents a collective decision that we owe a debt to the dead, that we must tend to their memory as carefully as we might tend to a garden. And it is not without reason that these cemeteries are often described in terms of quiet beauty. The landscape design is deliberate, the setting is peaceful, because part of the task of remembering is to acknowledge the humanity of those who died, to place them in a context of dignity and calm, rather than to dwell only on the violence of their passing. But memorials are not only physical places, they are also, in a real sense, carried in the minds and hearts of those who bear witness to them. The children who visit with their grandparents, who hear stories of what happened on these fields, carry forward a kind of living memory. The students who come on school trips, reading the explanatory plaques and trying to imagine what it might have been like, become, in their own way, keepers of the past. The regular visitors, the people who come back year after year to stand at a particular place and think of someone they knew or knew about, maintain a kind of personal connection to history that no monument, however well crafted, can fully represent. It is worth considering what it means that we have chosen to remember Falaise, not primarily through grand celebration, but through quiet memorials in the landscape where it occurred. There are no triumphant arches here, no statuary celebrating victory. Instead, there are modest monuments acknowledging sacrifice, and the landscape itself speaks more eloquently perhaps than any human inscription could. The fields remember, the roads remember, the few buildings that remained from before the war, that have stood in the same place for centuries, remember. And in that remembering, which requires no words, there is a kind of truth that is more profound than any historical account, however detailed, could fully capture. The question of how to remember is not a simple one, and different people and different nations have arrived at different answers. But the common thread seems to be that forgetting is not an option that any community has truly chosen. The memorials exist, the pilgrimages continue, the stories are told, and each year, as new generations grow to adulthood, they are invited to step into these places and to carry forward, in whatever way feels right to them, the acknowledgement of what happened here and what it cost. What remains, now, after all the motion has ceased? The fields around Falaise have grown quiet again. 80 years have passed since the last shots echoed across those Norman meadows, since the last exhausted soldier stumbled through the darkened lanes, seeking shelter or surrender. The grass has grown thick and green many times over. The roads have been repaired, straightened in places, smoothed by commerce and passage. And yet, if you were to walk there today, on an autumn afternoon when the light falls at that particular slant that it did in August 1944, something of what occurred remains written into the very earth itself. This is perhaps the deepest lesson that these old battlefields offer us, that history is not merely a thing of documents and dates, not simply a collection of facts to be memorized and filed away. History is woven into landscape, it settles into soil, it becomes part of the character of a place. the way that certain fields hold a particular sadness, or certain small woods carry within them the weight of what was lost there. The people who lived through those 8 days in the Falaise pocket are almost entirely gone now. The soldiers who wrote letters home, who thought of their families, who questioned whether they would see another sunrise, most of them have passed into silence. The children of Normandy, who watched the armies advance and retreat across their villages, are now themselves in their 90s, or have followed their parents into memory. And yet we continue to search for them, don't we? We continue to want to understand what they experienced, what they felt, what they chose or were forced to choose in those compressed, terrible hours when the pocket tightened and the escape routes narrowed, and the sky above filled with the roar of engines and the whistle of falling bombs. There is perhaps something deeply human in this impulse, this need to honor the dead not through grand monuments alone, though those have their place, but through the small act of listening, through the quiet effort of imagining what it might have felt like to be cold and hungry and frightened in the dark, to be far from home, to know that the end was coming, though not precisely when or how. The historians continue their work. New documents are found. New accounts emerge from family archives and dusty collections. The debates continue about casualty figures, about how many escaped, about the precise responsibility of various commanders for the decisions that were made. These questions matter. They matter because they represent our ongoing attempt to understand what happened and why, to extract lessons and meaning from suffering so that such suffering might be diminished in the future. But there is a limit, too, to what documents can tell us. There is a mystery at the heart of history that no archive can fully penetrate. The mystery of individual consciousness, of what it felt like in the moment to be afraid, to be brave, to be ordinary, and suddenly thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps this is why we return, again and again, to these stories, not to solve them completely, but to sit with them for a while, to let them work on us, to remind ourselves that behind every statistic, every casualty figure, every notation in a military record, there was a person, someone with hopes and fears and small private thoughts that no one will ever fully know. The Waffen-SS soldier who died at Falaise was not merely a soldier, he was someone's son, someone's brother, perhaps someone's lover or friend. He had moments of kindness and moments of cruelty. He was shaped by the historical forces that surrounded him, but he was also, in some fundamental way, himself. Irreducible and singular, and now forever inaccessible to us, except through these fragmentary rememberings. There is a strange grace in this inaccessibility, perhaps. It prevents us from the arrogance of thinking we have fully understood another human being. It keeps us humble. It reminds us that the past is genuinely past, that it cannot be recovered in its fullness, only approached and circled around and contemplated with appropriate care. The grass that grows on Montormel today does not know the tanks that once rumbled across its slopes. The stones of Chambois bear no memory of the columns that poured through their streets. The river Dives flows on with its current, indifferent to the blood that was once shed in its waters. This is not a failure of memory. Rather, it is the way that nature, in its vast and patient indifference, gradually converts tragedy into landscape. Yet the weight remains, subtle, persistent. If you speak with people who have lived their entire lives in that region, who have walked the same paths that soldiers walked, who have heard stories passed down from parents and grandparents, you will find that there is a particular consciousness there, a knowing, a sort of tender melancholy. The Norman countryside carries its own particular beauty, and some of that beauty is inseparable from what happened there. When tourists walk through the memorial gardens, when they read the plaques and contemplate the photographs, something shifts in them. A recognition, perhaps, a sense that this particular corner of the earth has been marked by something significant, that mortality walked here in concentrated form, and that we are not separate from that mortality, but continuous with it. This is what old battlefields teach us, in their wordless way. They teach us that time moves in only one direction, and that all of us are moving through it, whether we acknowledge it or not. The soldiers at Falaise were moving through time. The commanders making their decisions in tents and command posts were moving through time. We who listen to this account, 80 years later, are also moving through time. In some future that we cannot imagine, people will be standing where we stand, contemplating our moment with the same mixture of understanding and incomprehension with which we contemplate the Falaise pocket. Chance moved through all of this. Chance and circumstance and accident. A shell that landed 2 feet to the left instead of 2 feet to the right, and a man lived instead of dying. A messenger who arrived late with orders, which meant that a tactical decision was made differently than it might have been. An officer who chose mercy when he might have chosen severity. An ordinary soldier who spoke up at a crucial moment. A night that was dark enough to slip through when another night might have been clear. All of these small chances accumulated and shaped what emerged from those 8 days. Not a tidy story with a clean conclusion, but a chaotic tangle of human choices and natural forces and random events. And now we sit with this tangle as the world grows quiet around us. The fields beyond the windows, wherever you are, have their own silence tonight. The sky above holds its own indifference. The passage of time continues, as it always does, carrying us all forward into a future we cannot see. The soldiers of the Falaise pocket are no longer here to tell us what it was like. The officers who made the decisions are no longer here to defend or explain themselves. The civilians who watched their homeland be torn apart are no longer here to describe the experience in their own voices. All that remains is what they left behind, the traces in the earth, the photographs and documents, the stories that have been preserved and passed down, and the possibility of understanding, however partial and however humble, that might arise when we sit quietly and contemplate what they endured. This understanding changes nothing about what happened. It does not bring anyone back. It does not undo any suffering or loss. But it does something else, perhaps. It holds space for the acknowledgement that human beings matter, that their choices matter, that their suffering was real, and their courage was real, and their fear was real. That the boundaries between us and them, between now and then, are thinner than we sometimes imagine, that we carry within us the potential for both the actions that were performed at Falaise and the restraint that was sometimes, in certain moments, also shown there, that we, like them, are mortal, we are fragile. We are moving through time toward an end we cannot prevent. In the fields around Falaise, where so many fell, the grain grows now. It is harvested each year and becomes bread on distant tables. The cycle continues. The fields do their quiet work, converting sunlight and rain and the minerals of the earth into nourishment. There is something deeply consoling about this, not a consolation that erases what happened, but rather one that acknowledges that life continues, that the world renews itself, that even in the places where terrible things have occurred, there can be beauty and growth and the ongoing mystery of existence. As you rest now, as your mind begins to drift towards sleep, you might hold this thought gently. The same earth that received the fallen at Falaise continues to rotate, continues to orbit the sun. The same light that fell on those desperate soldiers continues to fall on their graves, on the memorials erected to their memory, on the faces of visitors who come to remember. You are part of this same continuing story. Your breath moves in and out, just as theirs did, though theirs has stopped. Your heart beats with the same ancient rhythm that beat in the chests of those men 80 years ago. This is not a comforting thought, perhaps, but there is a kind of peace in it nonetheless. A peace in recognizing that mortality is not a private tragedy, but a universal condition, that all of us are held by time and landscape and the slow work of forgetting and remembering that constitutes human memory. The Falaise pocket has become history now. The urgency is gone, the decisions have been made, and their consequences have unfolded across the decades. What remains is reflection, and the slow, patient work of understanding. And that work can continue, if we choose, for as long as we remain.